She had spent 23 years learning how to disappear. But the night a cold-eyed duke walked into that library and looked directly at her, not through her, not past her, Lydia Vale felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "I found you," he whispered. 3 words, and suddenly the invisible girl became the most dangerous person in the room, because what he'd found wasn't just a servant, he'd found the woman they'd stolen everything from. Stay until the end, because this story doesn't end with survival, it ends with power. Drop your city in the comments, like if you're already hooked. England, 1847. The rain had been falling since Tuesday. By Friday evening, it had settled into something less like weather and more like a permanent condition. A cold, gray curtain drawn across the moors of northern England, blurring the edges of hedgerows and stone walls and the lonely ribbon of road that wound toward Ravenhurst Manor like a scar across pale skin. Inside the manor, the candles burned low. In the East Wing drawing room, Lady Cornelia Thornbridge held court from her high-backed chair the way a dying sovereign holds court, with absolute authority and no actual power left to exercise. She was 61 years old, though she carried it like a woman who had decided that aging was something that happened to other people. Her silver hair was dressed immaculately. Her spine was rigid as ironwork. Her expression, as always, sat somewhere between displeasure and contempt, as though the world had long ago failed to meet her standards and she had simply never recovered from the disappointment. Across the room, near the fireplace, close enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible, stood Lydia Vale. She was pouring tea. It was, by any reasonable accounting, a simple act. A silver pot, a porcelain cup, a measured pour. But Lydia had learned over 3 years of service that nothing in Ravenhurst Manor was simple. The tea had to be exactly the right temperature. Not scalding, which Lady Thornbridge found vulgar, and not merely warm, which she found insulting. The cup had to be placed at precisely the right angle. The saucer had to be dry. The spoon had to be positioned at 4 o'clock, not 3, not 5. 4. She set the cup down without a sound. Lady Thornbridge did not look up from her correspondence. She never did. That was the thing about being a shadow. You learn to read the room by the quality of silences. This one said, acceptable, not good, not appreciated, simply acceptable. Lydia had long since stopped hoping for more. She stepped back to her position by the wall, the particular stretch of paneling between the second window and the walnut bookcase where she spent most of her evenings, and folded her hands and waited to be needed again. No one in the room spoke to her. There were 4 other people present: Lady Thornbridge's son Gerald, 29 and already soft around the jaw from too much port and too little conscience; Gerald's wife Millicent, who had the eyes of someone perpetually calculating something; a visiting cousin named Edmund, who arrived each autumn and managed to say very little while consuming an extraordinary amount; and the household steward, Mr. Granger, who stood near the door like a piece of furniture that had grown uncomfortable opinions. None of them looked at Lydia. This was not rudeness exactly. Rudeness required acknowledgement. What Lydia received was something more thorough, a complete and practiced absence of notice, as though her presence in the room registered at roughly the same level as the wallpaper or the brass clock on the mantelpiece. She existed in the negative space between the people who mattered. She had been existing this way for 3 years. Before that, 2 years at a lesser estate in Devonshire, companion to an elderly widow who had at least possessed the decency to occasionally ask Lydia's opinion before ignoring it. Before that, a girls' school in Bath on a scholarship whose origin she had never been fully told. Before that, nothing she liked to visit. A childhood composed mostly of closed doors and lowered voices, and the particular shame of being a child that powerful people preferred not to think about. She was the unacknowledged daughter of Lord Edmund Vale, the 4th Earl of Ashcroft. He had never denied it, precisely. He had simply never confirmed it either. There was a difference, she had learned, between a lie and a silence. And her father had been a master of the silence. He died when she was 16, leaving behind a considerable estate, 3 legitimate sons, and 1 daughter he had apparently forgotten to mention in any legally binding document. Or so she had been told. She poured herself no tea. She ate when the kitchen sent up a tray, which happened most evenings around 9 o'clock, a tray carried by a housemaid named Bessie, who always knocked twice and sometimes lingered to talk about the village, which Lydia found she liked more than she let on. She slept in a room on the third floor that was technically a bedroom and practically a storage space that had been cleared of half its furniture to accommodate a bed and a small writing desk. She read when she could. She kept careful notes when she thought it useful. She had taught herself bookkeeping from a manual she'd found in the manor library 2 winters ago, and had spent the past 4 months quietly reviewing Ravenhurst's estate accounts because she had nothing else to do in the evenings, and because numbers, unlike people, behaved predictably. It was the numbers that had first made her afraid. Not tonight, though. Tonight she simply stood by her wall and waited, and the rain came down, and the fire burned, and Lady Thornbridge read her letters, and no one said a word to Lydia Vale. Until the carriage arrived. She heard it before anyone else did. That was another thing about being invisible. Your other senses sharpened. She heard the iron wheels on the gravel drive a full 30 seconds before Gerald looked up from his port glass, and she had already registered the weight of it. Heavy, well-sprung, expensive, and the sound of the horses. 4, not 2, before Mr. Granger moved to the window. "A carriage, my lady," he said. "I can hear," Lady Thornbridge replied, not looking up. "At this hour," Millicent said softly, with the particular inflection she used for things she found distasteful. Gerald rose and went to the window. Whatever he saw made him go still in a way that Lydia noticed. A careful stillness, the kind that preceded performance. He turned back to the room with his face composed into careful neutrality. "It's Blackmore," he said. The temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees. Lady Thornbridge set down her correspondence. It was the first time in 3 hours she had moved, and the action carried the weight of genuine attention, the kind she rarely gave to anything. "Duke Adrian Blackmore?" Millicent said. "Here, tonight? Gerald, you didn't mention—" "I didn't know," Gerald said, too quickly. "You didn't know," his mother repeated, in a tone that made it clear she found this less plausible than he had intended. Mr. Granger was already moving toward the door. In the hallway beyond, Lydia could hear the sound of the front entrance being opened, the rush of rain-cold air, the measured voice of someone issuing an instruction. Then footsteps. Unhurried, deliberate, each one placed like a chess piece. She pressed back toward her wall. She did not know much about Duke Adrian Blackmore, but she knew what everyone knew, which was to say she knew the shape of his reputation, the outline the rumors had carved. He was 35, unmarried now for 4 years, and the word now carried all its freight. His wife had died in the winter of 1843, under circumstances that no one had officially questioned, and everyone had privately never stopped questioning. She had been found at the base of the east staircase of Blackmore Hall, and the coroner had ruled it an accident, and Adrian Blackmore had stood at her graveside in the snow with an expression that witnesses consistently described as unreadable, which people had then spent the better part of 4 years trying to read. He controlled 3 estates, a voting bloc in the Lords, and enough financial interest in half a dozen northern industries to make powerful men return his letters the same day they received them. He was not, by any account, a man who arrived at rain-soaked manor houses unannounced at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening for no particular reason. The door opened. He was taller than she expected. She didn't know why she had expected anything. She had never seen him, had only the verbal sketches that gossip provided, and gossip was always more interested in scandal than specifics. But there was something about the way he occupied the doorway, for just a moment before stepping through it, that suggested a man who was rarely surprised by the dimensions of a room, and occasionally surprised by nothing at all. He was dark-featured, sharp-jawed, with eyes the color of deep water in poor light. Not quite gray, not quite blue, the kind of color that changed depending on what he was looking at. He wore riding clothes, though the carriage had been a carriage and not a horse, and there was road dust on his coat that he had not bothered to remove, which somehow made him look less disheveled and more deliberate, as though disorder were simply a choice he was making. "Lady Thornbridge," he said. His voice was even. "Forgive the hour." "Your Grace." Well, Lady Thornbridge rose, she always rose for a duke, whatever she thought of him privately, and offered her hand. "This is an unexpected visit." "I was traveling north," he said without elaboration. "The road through the village was washed. Your steward was kind enough to offer the manor." This was a lie. Lydia didn't know how she knew it, only that she did, the same way she knew when the accounts didn't add up. Something in the precision of it, the detail of the washed road, offered too smoothly, as though it had been prepared. Mr. Granger, she noted, did not contradict it. "Of course," Lady Thornbridge said. "You are very welcome." Gerald had not moved from his position near the window. His face was still arranged in that careful neutrality, but his right hand, she noticed, had closed around the stem of his port glass with the particular grip of a man trying very hard not to show that he was gripping something. The Duke turned to survey the room. A slow, unhurried scan, the kind of look that wasn't social courtesy but something else, something that collected and catalogued. His gaze moved from Gerald to Millicent to Edmund to the steward to... He stopped. Lydia felt it before she fully processed it, the specific quality of being seen by someone who was actually looking. It was so unlike her usual experience of rooms that for a moment her body didn't know what to do with it. She was standing in her usual spot between the window and the bookcase, hands folded, face composed into the expression she wore like armor, and the Duke of Blackmore was looking directly at her. Not through her, not past her. At her. She held very still. His eyes stayed on her face for 3 full seconds. She counted, involuntarily. And then he looked away, back to Lady Thornbridge, and the conversation resumed and the room moved on, and Lydia was invisible again. But her heart was doing something strange and unhelpful in her chest, and the number 3 kept repeating itself in the back of her mind like something she was supposed to remember. She was dismissed at 9:30. This was the usual time. Lady Thornbridge required her from 4 in the afternoon until 9:30, at which point she said, "That will be all," without looking up, and Lydia took the small lamp from the side table and walked the long corridor to the back stairs and climbed 3 flights to her room. It was a routine as familiar as breathing, and she had long since stopped feeling anything particular about it. Tonight she stopped in the library. She did this sometimes. The library sat off the main corridor, and she had a key because Lady Thornbridge occasionally sent her to retrieve books, and had never thought to ask for the key back, which was either an oversight or indifference, and was, in practical terms, the same thing. The library at Ravenhurst was better than the one in Devonshire had been. Deeper shelves, older volumes, and a small reading table by the window where she would sometimes sit for an hour with a candle and a ledger or a novel, depending on what she needed. Tonight she needed the ledger, not the household accounts. Those were kept in the steward's office, and she had no official access to them. What she had was a copy she had made herself over the course of 4 months, during the small windows of time when Mr. Granger left the office unlocked, and she had reason to be in that wing of the house. She had not taken the original. She had simply looked, and she had a very good memory, and she had written down what she remembered in a small notebook that she kept under the loose floorboard beneath her writing desk. She lit the reading lamp, settled at the table, and opened the notebook to the page she had been returning to for 3 weeks. The numbers were not adding up. They had not been adding up since August, when she'd first noticed a discrepancy in the quarterly agricultural rents, a sum listed as collected from the Thornbridge tenants on the eastern parcels that did not match the figures she had found in an older ledger volume from the manor library, which recorded the assessed rental values of those same parcels as significantly higher. The difference, across 12 properties over 18 months, came to a number that made her sit very still in her chair the first time she'd arrived at it. £7,430. Not missing exactly. Not simply absent from the columns where it should appear. Redirected. Moved through a series of internal accounts with different names, appearing and disappearing in patterns that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't looking at several ledgers simultaneously and had the specific kind of mind that noticed when numbers were misbehaving. She had that kind of mind. She had always had it, and it had never been useful to her before. And she had not yet decided what to make of the fact that it was useful now, here, in this particular manner, with these particular numbers pointing in this particular direction. She was deep in the columns when she heard the door. She looked up. The Duke of Blackmore stood in the library doorway. He was still in his traveling clothes. He had not yet been shown to a guest room, or had chosen not to use one, or was conducting his evening differently from how she imagined guests conducted their evenings. He held no lamp. The light from her candle and the glow from the low fire in the library's grate were enough to illuminate the room adequately, and he stood in the edge of that light, looking at her with the same direct cataloging attention he had turned on her in the drawing room. "You're the companion," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "What's your name?" "Lydia Vale." "Your Grace." He said nothing for a moment. It's. Then he stepped into the room, moving to the shelves on the near wall with the ease of a man who entered other people's libraries and began examining their contents as a matter of course. "Late for reading," he said. "I find I work better in the evenings," she said carefully. "Work?" He pulled a volume from the shelf, glanced at the spine, returned it. "That's not a novel." She looked down at the notebook. She had not closed it quickly enough. She did now. With emotion she tried to make casual and suspected she failed. "Household notes," she said. He turned from the shelf and looked at her again. That same quality of attention, direct and unhurried, as though he had time to spare and intended to use it. "What sort of household notes?" he said, and it was not quite a question. The candle flame moved in a draft from the open door, and the light shifted across his face, and for a moment she could see something behind the careful composure. Not warmth exactly, but a quality of focus that was so thorough it was almost like being held still. She made a decision. She did not fully understand why. Later she would think it was the way he looked at her. Not the 3 seconds in the drawing room, but now, in the library, with the rain coming down outside and the household asleep, and the ledger numbers sitting in her notebook like a problem she had been unable to solve alone. She had been invisible for so long that the instinct to remain so had become entirely automatic, and something about being seen, genuinely, directly seen, had short-circuited it, or maybe it was simply that she was tired of carrying it by herself. "Estate accounts," she said. He was still. "Discrepancies," she added. He walked to the table and sat down across from her without being invited, which should have been presumptuous, but somehow wasn't. He put his hands flat on the table, on either side of where her notebook lay, and looked at her. "Show me," he said. She opened the notebook. Matt. She showed him everything. Not the original documents. She didn't have those. But her notes were meticulous, organized by property, parcel, and quarter, cross-referenced against the figures she'd found in the library's older ledger volumes, with her calculated discrepancies listed in a separate column. She walked him through it in a low voice, the candle burning down between them, and he listened without interrupting, which was, she found, a remarkable quality in a person, the capacity to simply receive information without performing a response to it while it was still arriving. He asked 2 questions. The first, "How long have you been looking at this?" 4 months, she said. "And before that, how long did it take you to notice something was wrong?" 3 days. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, not quite. Something more like the confirmation of a calculation. He looked back at the notebook and was quiet for a long moment. "The Thornbridge family," he said finally. "The redirection runs through accounts in Gerald Thornbridge's name," she said, "and through 2 external accounts whose registered addresses I couldn't verify." "You tried to verify them." "I wrote letters," she said, "as though on Lady Thornbridge's behalf, for correspondence purposes." Neither address returned a reply. He looked up at her, and then he said the thing that changed everything. Not, "I found you," not yet, that came later, though she would remember it as coming earlier, the way the mind reorganizes significant moments into chronological poetry rather than the messier truth of sequence. What he said was, "Your father was Edmund Vale." It was not a question. She felt the blood leave her face. "He was a friend of mine," Adrian Blackmore said quietly. "One of the few I've had. He died when you were 16. "Yes," she whispered. "He told me about you." His voice remained even, but there was something in it, a weight, a careful bearing of something that had been carried for some time. "He told me quite a lot toward the end. He was not," he said, "a man without regrets." The fire popped, the candle guttered. Outside, the rain had softened from a downpour to a steady murmur against the window glass, and the library felt very small and very far away from the rest of the world. "He left a will," the Duke said. She looked at him. "I know," she said, because she had always known there must have been something, some document, some provision, some scrap of acknowledgement from a man who had been, in the end, incapable of complete erasure. "I was told there was nothing." "You were told incorrectly," he said. "Or rather, you were told a deliberate lie by people who had a great deal to gain from your believing it." She sat very still. The notebook was still open between them, her 4 months of careful numbers filling the pages in her small, precise hand, and she was suddenly aware of a connection she hadn't drawn before. The financial fraud she'd found, the lies she'd been told, the family that had benefited from both. "The estate," she said slowly. He looked at her without speaking, which was, she was learning, his way of letting her arrive at things herself. "He left me the estate," she said. "Ravenhurst." "Not just Ravenhurst," Adrian said quietly. "His full estate. The manor, the land, the income from the parcels, the liquid holdings. Everything." She heard the words. They landed at a remove, the way very large things sometimes did, not immediately, not with the weight they would eventually carry, but lightly, preliminary, like the first few drops before the real rain comes. "That's not possible," she said, and then immediately, "No, I know it's possible. I know it happened." She pressed her hand flat against the open page of the notebook. "They've been stealing from my estate." "Yes." "For how long?" 7 years, he said. "Since the month your father died." She was quiet for a long time. The candle burned. Somewhere in the manor, a clock struck 10. Lydia Vale sat in the library of the house she had served for 3 years, the house that had always been, hers, and felt the ground beneath her entire life rearranging itself. She thought about the tea she had poured at exactly the right angle. She thought about the room on the 3rd floor where she slept, surrounded by displaced furniture. She thought about the tray that arrived at 9 o'clock, and the housemaid who knocked twice, and the small, necessary kindnesses of people lower on the household ladder than herself, which was to say, everyone. She thought about 3 years of practiced invisibility in a house where she was, in every legal and material sense, the owner. She looked up at the Duke of Blackmore, who was watching her with that steady, unreadable attention, and she felt something shift deep in her chest, not breaking, not collapsing, something more like a wall coming down. The careful, protective wall she had built over 23 years of being nobody, and behind it, very quietly, something that had never quite been extinguished. "They'll know," she said. "When you start asking questions, they'll know someone is looking. They'll move to protect themselves." "Yes," he said again. "They'll try to remove me first," she said. "I'm the witness. I'm the one who found the accounts." "They'll try," he said, with an emphasis so slight it was barely there at all. She looked at him for a long moment. "You've been planning this," she said. "Coming here tonight? This isn't the first time you've been looking into this." He held her gaze. "Your father asked me to watch over you. I made him a promise." "I have not," he said quietly, "been entirely faithful to the timeline he might have hoped for, but I'm here now." "Why now?" "Because now," he said, "you found the accounts, and that means you're no longer simply a woman in danger of being overlooked. You're a woman in danger, full stop." He paused. "There's a difference." She thought about Gerald's hand on the port glass. She thought about Millicent's eyes, always calculating. She thought about the letter she had found last week in the corridor, dropped, she supposed, by accident, though nothing in this house happened by complete accident. A letter in Gerald Thornbridge's hand, addressed to a solicitor in London, that she had read in the 30 seconds it took to ascertain that it was not meant for her, and had not been able to entirely unread since. The letter had used the phrase "the Vale matter" in a way that suggested it had a prior history of being discussed. It had used the phrase "resolved before winter" in a way that had kept her awake 2 nights running. She had not told anyone. She told him now. He listened with the same quality of perfect attention, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How quickly can you gather your documents?" She touched the notebook. "They're here." "Then listen to me carefully," he said, leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table, voice dropping to something that was almost but not quite intimate. Not tender, not yet, but close. The kind of closeness forged in shared urgency. You are going to go to your room tonight and behave exactly as you always do. Tomorrow morning you will serve Lady Thornbridge her tea at the correct angle on the correct saucer with the spoon at 4 o'clock, and you will be invisible, and you will give them no reason to act quickly." "And you?" she said. "I'll be moving quietly too," he said. "We have perhaps a week before they realize the shape of what's happening. And if we don't have a week?" He looked at her steadily. "Then we'll have less time and the same outcome." She almost smiled. "You're very certain of the outcome," she said. "I have the will," he said simply. "I have a barrister. I have witnesses to the document's authentication. What I needed was the evidence of the fraud, evidence that would give us grounds for immediate legal action rather than a prolonged dispute." He touched the notebook. "That's what you've been building for 4 months." She looked at the notebook. At 4 months of her own careful, meticulous late-night labor, the labor she had undertaken out of nothing more than the habits of a mind that couldn't leave wrong numbers alone. "I didn't know what I was building," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why it's real." She picked up the notebook and held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Thin, small, unassuming, a collection of copied figures and patient arithmetic, and inside it, somehow, the architecture of an entire life reclaimed. She stood. He stood too. A courtesy she had not expected, and which landed somewhere complicated. "I'll go back to my room," she said. "Yes." She moved toward the door and then stopped and turned back because there was one more thing. One thing she had to say while the library was still quiet, and the rain still fell, and they were still the only 2 people in the world who knew what she had built. "He never acknowledged me," she said. "My father. Not once, not publicly, not in any way that anyone else could see." Adrian Blackmore was quiet. "But he left me everything," she said. "Yes," the Duke said. She nodded once, and she carried her lamp and her notebook and her newly rearranged world back through the dark manor, up 3 flights of back stairs, to the room with the displaced furniture and the loose floorboard, the room in the house that was hers, and she lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that her body recognized cautiously, tentatively, as the distant precursor to something like hope. Outside, the rain continued. In the library below, the candle burned down to nothing. And in the East Wing drawing room, Gerald Thornbridge poured himself a second glass of port and stared into the fire with the expression of a man who could feel, without being able to name it, that something in the house had shifted. He was right, but he didn't yet know how completely. The next morning, Lydia poured the tea at the correct angle, spoon at 4 o'clock, and wore her invisibility like a weapon for the first time in her life. Because for the first time, she knew exactly what she was waiting for. The morning after the Duke's arrival, Ravenhurst Manor woke up differently. Not loudly. There was nothing so honest as a loud change. The difference was in the smaller things, the things that Lydia had trained herself to notice the way a sailor notices the shift in wind before the sky shows any sign of what's coming. The way Mr. Granger moved through the corridors at a pace that was almost, but not quite, his usual pace. The way Gerald Thornbridge appeared at breakfast 20 minutes earlier than his custom, fully dressed, which he never was before 10 o'clock on a Saturday. The way Millicent's eyes moved when the Duke entered the breakfast room, not to his face, as courtesy required, but to the document case he carried under one arm, and then away again too quickly, with the particular speed of someone who has seen something and does not want to be seen seeing it. Lydia noticed all of it. She stood at the sideboard near the window and poured tea and did not exist, and she catalogued every detail with the same careful precision she had given to the estate accounts, because survival in environments like this one had always depended on the same fundamental skill, seeing everything while appearing to see nothing. "Your Grace," Gerald said, with the warmth of a man performing warmth rather than feeling it, "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," Adrian said. He set his document case on the chair beside him. Beside him, Lydia noted, not beneath it, not tucked away. Beside him, visible, a deliberate placement, and accepted the coffee that was offered without looking at whoever offered it. "The East Wing is comfortable." "We're glad to have you," Lady Thornbridge said from her position at the head of the table. She had dressed with particular care this morning, Lydia noticed. The gray silk, which was her armor dress, the one she wore for solicitors and difficult conversations. You mentioned last night that your road north was flooded. The Harwick crossing, Adrian said. Yes. Lady Thornbridge spread butter on her toast with the precision of a woman who expressed all her tension through small physical acts. It floods every autumn. You'll have remembered that, I expect, having traveled this road before. The pause that followed was less than a second, but it was there. I have, Adrian said without inflection. Millicent reached for the sugar bowl. Her fingers were steady, but she reached for it with her left hand, and she was right-handed, and Lydia, who had 3 years of observation stored in a very organized mind, had never once seen Millicent Thornbridge reach for anything with her left hand before. She was nervous. They were all nervous. And the Duke sat at their breakfast table and ate his eggs and made pleasant, unhurried conversation and did not appear to notice any of it, which meant Lydia was nearly certain that he noticed every particle of it. She refilled Lady Thornbridge's cup. That will do, Lady Thornbridge said, which was as close as she came to a social acknowledgement. Lydia stepped back to the sideboard. From this position, she could see the whole table, Gerald's jaw working slightly faster than the food in front of him required. Millicent's cup raised and lowered in a rhythm that wasn't thirst, but something more like the need for repeated small actions. Edmund, the cousin, shoveling through his breakfast with the peaceful obliviousness of a man who understood very little about what rooms he was in, and Lady Thornbridge, upright and silver-haired and sharp as a letter opener, watching the Duke with the steady attention of someone waiting for an opening that had not yet presented itself. And Adrian Blackmore cutting his toast into precise thirds, apparently entirely at ease in the manner he was quietly taking apart from the inside. Lydia kept her face empty and her hands still, and her heart at the measured pace she had taught it over 23 years of practice. And she waited. Fuck. The first real strike came before noon. She was in the corridor outside the small sitting room, carrying a stack of correspondence that Lady Thornbridge had asked her to sort and post, when she heard the voices, Gerald's first, lower and flatter than his breakfast performance, and then Millicent's, precise and quick, the way she spoke when she was moving through a problem rather than around it. Lydia did not stop walking. She had learned long ago that stopping announced itself. The absence of footsteps was as loud as a slammed door. She kept her pace, steady and unremarkable, and she passed the partially open door, and in the 3 seconds of the passage she collected what she could. Can't be a coincidence, Gerald. He doesn't travel without purpose. You're reading significance into a flooded road. I am reading the document case he carried to breakfast, which no man brings to a breakfast table unless you don't know what's in it. And that is precisely the problem. She turned the corner and kept walking, the letters in her arms, her face arranged into its habitual blankness. Her mind was running very fast underneath it. They had noticed the document case, which meant that whatever comfortable fiction Gerald had been maintaining, that the Duke's arrival was coincidence, a flooded road, and an opportunistic overnight nothing more, was already beginning to erode. Millicent was sharper than her husband, had always been, and she had her teeth in something now, and that made the timeline Adrian had described, a week, perhaps, feel suddenly optimistic. She posted the letters and returned to the upper corridor and found, when she came around the bend near the linen closet, Mr. Granger standing outside her bedroom door. He was not doing anything in particular. He was simply standing there, arms at his sides, with the mild non-expression of a man who had some perfectly ordinary reason to be exactly where he was and would be entirely happy to explain it if asked. Lydia kept walking toward him. "Mr. Granger," she said. "Miss Vale." He stepped slightly away from the door, not all the way, a partial repositioning. "Lady Thornbridge has asked me to remind you that the afternoon correspondence review has been moved to 2 o'clock. "Thank you," she said. She reached past him, opened the door with her key, entered and closed it behind her, and stood with her back against the wood and breathed for exactly 4 seconds. Then she crossed to the writing desk. She lifted the loose board. The notebook was there. She picked it up and held it and thought about where else it could go, whether there was anywhere safer, or whether safety was the wrong frame for it, because the problem was not the notebook's location, but the fact that someone was now, apparently, interested enough in the notebook's owner to stand outside her door. She thought about the previous evening in the library. About the way Adrian had said gather your documents with a particular quality of urgency that she had at the time attributed to general caution and was now reconsidering. She put the notebook inside her dress, against her side, under the stays where it made no visible outline. Then she went to the 2 o'clock correspondence review, and she sat across from Lady Thornbridge, and she read letters aloud in a steady voice while Lady Thornbridge dictated replies. And neither of them said anything of significance, and the afternoon passed in its usual careful theater of normalcy. While somewhere in the manor, the pieces of something much larger were being quietly moved into position. She found the note at 4 o'clock, slipped under the library door. It was folded once, no name on the outside. Inside, in a hand she recognized from the 3 seconds she'd spent examining the signature on a document in the estate office 2 months ago. Precise, left-leaning, economical. 3 words. The garden. 6. She burned it in the fireplace grate and went to the garden at 6. The light at that hour in October was the color of old copper, low and sideways, turning the stone walls of the manor garden amber and casting shadows that leaned long across the gravel paths. Adrian was there already, standing near the far wall where the kitchen garden gave way to a more ornamental section of box hedging, hands in the pockets of a coat that was more appropriate to the weather than his traveling clothes had been. He turned when he heard her step on the gravel. "Granger was outside my room," she said, without preamble. "I know," he said. "I saw him in the corridor this morning as well. He's been instructed to watch you." "By Gerald or by Millicent?" "Millicent," he said, and something in the certainty of it told her he'd already confirmed this, not guessed at it. "She's the one managing the practical concern. Gerald is handling himself less well." Lydia stopped a few feet away from him and looked at the hedge, which was shaped into geometric precision that required enormous ongoing effort and struck her, not for the first time, as a reasonably accurate metaphor for how the Thornbridge family operated. Everything carefully shaped, nothing allowed to grow in the direction it actually wanted to grow. "How long have you known about Granger?" she asked. "I've suspected his complicity for 2 years," Adrian said. "He's been receiving supplementary payments from Gerald's private account. Not large amounts, enough to secure loyalty and silence, not enough to make him a principal actor. He won't move against you directly. He's watching you because Millicent wants to know if you've been talking to me." "Have we been observed?" she said. "Last night, in the library." "I don't believe so," he said, "but I want to operate as though we might have been." "What does that mean practically?" He turned to face her fully, and there was something different in his expression at this hour. The breakfast room composure was still present, but at lower pressure, the way a man's face changes when the performance is temporarily suspended. Not soft. Sharper, actually, more concentrated. "It means we need to accelerate," he said. "I had planned for a week. I think we have less." "How much less?" "I'm meeting with my barrister by correspondence. I sent 3 letters this morning from the village post office. Not from the manor." He paused. "I need you to get me access to the original estate account books, the ones in Granger's office." She looked at him. "I've been in that office," she said carefully. "I don't have a key." "But you've been inside." "When Granger is present, for specific purposes." "Is there any purpose," he said, "that would legitimately take you there alone?" She thought about it. Not the hesitation of reluctance, but the practical turning over of possibilities, the same mental motion she used with ledgers. "Lady Thornbridge occasionally sends me with documents for filing when Granger is out of the house. He's out Thursday mornings. He drives to the village market for the household supplies. It takes roughly 2 hours. "That's 4 days," Adrian said. "I need it sooner." "Then we need to create a reason for Granger to leave the house," she said. "Something genuine enough that he doesn't question it, short enough that I have a sufficient window, and unconnected enough to both of us that it isn't traced back." He looked at her steadily. "You've thought about this before," he said. "I've thought about a lot of things," she said. "Living the way I live creates a great deal of thinking time." Something moved in his eyes. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it, brief and then gone, like light off water. "I can arrange a delivery to the village," he said. "Something requiring the steward's specific authorization. The kind of minor administrative matter that Granger handles personally because he doesn't trust Gerald to manage it without him. Tomorrow afternoon, if I time it correctly. Tomorrow, she said. Yes. Can you be ready? She thought of the office, its layout, where Granger kept the locked box where the primary account book sat, the fact that she had once watched him open it, the specific location of the key in the second drawer on the right side of the desk, the way the lock engaged with a sound she had filed away without knowing why at the time. Yes, she said. He nodded once. They stood for a moment in the copper light, the garden quiet around them except for a thrush somewhere in the hedging, and Lydia felt the particular quality of the silence. Not comfortable. Nothing was comfortable in this, but something beside comfortable. Something that acknowledged weight and held it steadily. You said last night that you promised my father you would watch over me, she said. Yes. Have you been? She kept her voice even. Watching over me. A pause. Not as I should have been, he said, and the admission was so direct and unadorned that she found it almost startling. A man of his stature offering accountability the way ordinary people did, without hedging or performance. I was involved with managing my own affairs, he said, after Eleanor died. He said the name simply, without flinching from it, without any of the elaborate avoidance she had observed in other people when they referenced his wife. There were things that required my full attention for a long time. By the time I had gathered myself sufficiently to act on your father's request, you had already been at Ravenhurst for 2 years. 2 years, she said. I know. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive the timeline. I'm asking you to trust that what I'm doing now is what I should have done sooner, and that I will not abandon it. Lydia studied his face in the fading light. She had trusted very few people in her life. The ones she had trusted had, on balance, not warranted it. Not viciously, not deliberately for the most part, but through the ordinary human failure of placing their own interests first when the choice arrived. She had adjusted her operating model accordingly and had not found it a particularly painful adjustment. It was simply a fact, like the weather, and you dressed for it. But there was something in the quality of Adrian Blackmore's attention, that direct, unhurried, total focus he trained on her, the same focus he brought to everything it seemed, that registered differently. It did not ask her to feel safe. It simply showed her very plainly where he was standing and why. She could make of it what she chose. Thursday mornings are also an option, she said, if tomorrow doesn't work. Tomorrow will work, he said. She nodded, turned, and walked back toward the house through the long copper shadows. Tomorrow did not entirely work. The arrangement had been precise. Adrian would send a note to Granger at 1:30, requesting his presence at the village chandler's to authorize a delivery of a specific household order that had apparently been complicated by a mismatch in invoice. The note was delivered. Granger left the house at 20 minutes to 2 in the slightly irritated manner of a man who finds administrative interruptions annoying, but is too invested in his own indispensability to delegate them. Lydia gave him 6 minutes. Then she walked to the steward's office, directly, unhurriedly, with a folder of Lady Thornbridge's correspondence in her hand, because she had learned the single most important principle of operating in hostile environments. If you must be seen, have a reason to be there. The office was unlocked. Granger had left in a hurry, and hurried people left things unlocked. She entered, closed the door behind her, and moved to the desk. The key was in the second drawer on the right. She opened the box. The account books were there, 4 of them, thick, leather-bound, the kind of record-keeping that predated Granger's tenure and would post-date it. The institutional memory of the estate written in columns going back 12 years. She opened the most recent one, found the quarterly rent records, and began. She had perhaps 40 minutes. She worked at the speed she had developed over 4 months of practice, not rushing, which created errors, but moving without hesitation, each page turned with intention, each figure cross-referenced against the notes she had committed to memory. She was not copying. She couldn't take the book, and she had no time to write. She was reading, and her memory was very good, and she was building the specific architecture of proof that would turn her notebook's careful reconstruction into a corroborated record. She was 17 minutes in when she heard Millicent Thornbridge's voice in the corridor outside. Barchiku. Should be able to find the quarterly summaries in Granger's office. Margaret would have filed them. Lydia closed the account book. She was across the room and had the key in the lock of the box before the footsteps reached the door, and the box was relocked and the key was back in the drawer before the handle turned. And when Millicent Thornbridge opened the door, Lydia was standing at the filing cabinet on the far wall with her folder of Lady Thornbridge's correspondence in her hand, looking at a section of files with the mild, focused expression of a woman running an errand. Millicent stopped. The two women looked at each other. In all the years Lydia had spent in Ravenhurst, she and Millicent had exchanged perhaps 30 words of genuine conversation. Millicent was not unkind, precisely. She was simply someone for whom Lydia did not register as a social entity, and their interactions had existed in the same register as one's interactions with particularly well-trained household objects, functional, unremarkable, and not invested with any particular emotional content. Something was different now. Millicent was looking at her, not through her, not past her, with an attention that was not warm and was not incurious. Her eyes moved from Lydia's face to the folder to the filing cabinet to the desk, taking in the room, checking the angles, calculating. "Miss Vale," she said. "Mrs. Thornbridge." Lydia held her folder with both hands steady. "I was looking for the correspondence file from August. Lady Thornbridge asked me to retrieve a letter." "Granger keeps those in the upper cabinet," Millicent said. Not helpfully. Observationally. A correction that was also a test. "Yes," Lydia said. "I was just finding my way." She crossed the room toward the door with her usual unhurried step, and Millicent stepped back to allow her passage, technically courteous, actually an inspection, and Lydia walked through and down the corridor and around the corner, and stood in the alcove behind the back staircase for exactly the time it took her to recollect herself. Then she went upstairs, retrieved her notebook from inside her dress, and added 16 minutes of account book data from memory, writing fast and precise until her hand ached. She had what she needed. She was also, she understood, no longer invisible to Millicent Thornbridge. The rules had changed. By evening, she felt the change in the house, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, not seen, not heard, but registered in the body, something that made the air feel denser and the silences between people fractionally longer. Dinner was the most instructive. She served, which was not her usual function. She was companion, not dining staff, but Lady Thornbridge had expressed a preference that she be present, which was the kind of preference that, in the compressed language of household service, contained a meaning beyond its surface. It meant, "I want you where I can see you." Lydia had complied, had stood near the sideboard and poured and replaced, and served with the soundless competence that had characterized 3 years of service, and she watched the table. Gerald was drinking more than he was eating. He had the look of a man who had sometime in the last several hours arrived at a conclusion he did not like and had not yet decided what to do with it. He looked at the Duke twice during the first course, both times quickly, both times away again before contact could be made. Millicent ate with precision and said very little. When she spoke, it was to direct conversation away from anything that approached the relevant. She steered topics toward autumn hunting, toward the condition of the roads, toward a neighbor's recent house party. With the skill of a woman who had spent years managing social situations and was currently deploying that skill in service of a specific tactical objective. Lady Thornbridge was watching everyone, which was her custom and her art. And Adrian sat at the table and ate his dinner and was pleasant and unhurried and present, and nothing about his behavior gave any indication that he had spent the afternoon reading through a secondary set of financial documents his own solicitor had sent by special courier to the village inn, or that those documents had confirmed what Lydia's notebook had reconstructed, or that the morning's note he'd sent to his barrister in London had set into motion a legal process that, once begun, would be very difficult to stop. He caught her eye once, briefly, across the room. Nothing in his face changed, but there was something in the quality of the look, a steadiness, a held attention, that said, "We are still on course." She looked away. She was replacing a wine glass near Gerald's elbow when he spoke to her. the first time in 3 years that he had addressed her with any specificity. "Miss Vale," he said, in a tone that was casual in the way of things that have been carefully prepared to sound casual. "You've been at Ravenhurst, what is it, 3 years now?" "Yes, sir," she said. "A long time." He turned the glass in his fingers. "You must know the estate quite well by now. The routines, the people." "I know my duties," she said. "Of course." He smiled, and the smile was the most frightening thing she had seen all day, because it was not hostile. It was almost friendly, the particular warmth of someone who has decided that a problem can be managed through charm before it needs to be managed through other means. "I only mean, you've become part of Ravenhurst. We'd hate to lose you." She looked at him for exactly the time it took to register what she'd heard. "Thank you, sir," she said, and moved back to the sideboard. The threat was so neatly wrapped it was almost elegant. She filed it in the part of her mind she was keeping for exactly this kind of information, beside the letter with the words "the Vale matter" and "resolved before winter," beside Millicent's eyes in the steward's office, beside Granger standing outside her door. They knew something. They weren't certain yet what they knew, but they were moving, and their movements had the quality of people trying to close a space before something escaped through it. She glanced at Adrian. He was listening to Lady Thornbridge's account of the neighbor's house party with the appearance of genuine interest. She envied him the composure, or rather, she did not envy it so much as observe it and measure her own against it, and find, to something between her surprise and her satisfaction, that they were not entirely unequal. The crisis came the next morning. She was at the writing desk before 6 o'clock, the notebook open, making the final connections. The last few properties, the last quarter, the figure at the bottom of her final column that represented the total of what had been taken from the estate she owned, when Bessie, the housemaid who knocked twice. She let her in. Bessie was 17 and honest, and had been at Ravenhurst since she was 14, and her face in the gray early morning light was doing something complicated that resolved, when she got inside the door and glanced behind her into the corridor, into urgency. "Miss," she said, low and fast, "there's going to be a meeting. Mr. Gerald and Mrs. Millicent and Lady Thornbridge and the steward. Mr. Granger called it last night after dinner. I heard him, miss. I was bringing up the coal, and the morning room door was open." Lydia set down her pen. "What kind of meeting?" "About you," Bessie said. Mr. Granger, he said he'd seen something in the office. He said—" She stopped, glanced at the door again, lowered her voice further. "He said you'd been looking at things you hadn't any business looking at." There it was. Millicent had told him. Or Granger himself had noticed. The relocked box, the specific files she'd been standing near, and reported it upward, and the family had convened, and by 8 o'clock this morning, they would make a decision about what to do about Lydia Vale, and the range of available decisions was not a range she wanted to leave to their discretion. "When?" she said. 7 o'clock, Bessie said. "Breakfast room, before His Grace comes down." Lydia looked at the clock on her writing desk. It was 6:10, 50 minutes. She looked at Bessie. "Thank you," she said, with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "Go about your morning exactly as usual. Don't say anything to anyone." Bessie nodded. She was not a girl who required long explanations, which was one of the things Lydia had always valued about her, and slipped out. Lydia sat for 3 seconds in the gray early light with the notebook in front of her, and 50 minutes on the clock and the accumulated weight of 3 years of invisible labor and 23 years of being no one concentrated in her chest, like something that had been compressed for a very long time and was deciding, without asking her permission, to expand. Then she picked up the notebook, left her room, and went directly to the East Wing guest corridor. She knocked on Adrian Blackmore's door at 6:15 in the morning. He opened it in 30 seconds, fully dressed, which told her he had not slept or had risen very early, and neither fact surprised her, and looked at her face and said nothing. "They're meeting at 7, she said. "Before you come down, Granger told them about the office." He looked at her for a moment, that focused, total attention, reading the situation through her face. "Then we don't wait," he said. "No," she agreed. "We don't." He He was already reaching for his document case. "I'll send the message to my barrister this morning," he said. "Not by post. I have a man in the village. He rides today." He paused. "Can you be in the east drawing room at 8 o'clock?" "I'll be wherever you need me to be," she said. 8 o'clock, he said again, with the quiet certainty of a man making a commitment. "Bring the notebook." She held it up. She had not put it down since she picked it up at 6:10. Something in his expression shifted. Barely, a fraction, but she caught it. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration. Something that landed in the space between recognition and resolve. "Go back to your room," he said. "Behave normally until 8, if they call you before that." "I know how to behave normally," she said. "I know you do," he said quietly. "I wasn't doubting you." She turned and walked back down the corridor, and behind her she heard the soft, decisive sound of his door closing, and then the very specific sound of a man who had made a decision moving with intention through a room. She went back to her writing desk. She did not sit down. She stood at the window and looked out at the gray October morning. The moors beyond the garden wall, the long pale sky, the stone and silence of an estate that was, by the law of a dead man's last honest act, entirely hers. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope. Closer than hope. Readiness. The kind that comes not from certainty about the outcome, but from the simple and total decision that you are done. Done being managed, done being invisible, done standing at the sideboard and pouring the tea at the correct angle while the people drinking it helped themselves to everything that should have been yours. The clock on her writing desk said 6:30. An hour and a half until everything changed. She stood at the window and watched the morning come in, and she did not look away from it. What? At 7 o'clock in the breakfast room, Gerald Thornbridge said a name that, by rights, should never have been spoken aloud in that house. The name was Lydia Vale. He spoke it with the particular cadence of a man presenting a problem that requires a solution, and 4 people sat around the table and discussed the solution, and none of them knew that the woman they were discussing was standing in a manner that was legally hers, holding the evidence of everything they had done, 40 feet down the corridor and 1 hour away from walking through a door that they would never be able to close again. At 7 o'clock in the breakfast room, Gerald Thornbridge said a name that, by rights, should never have been spoken aloud in that house. And the 4 people listening to him did not know that the hour they spent deliberating over Lydia Vale would be the last hour in which they held any power over her at all. She did not hear what they said. She didn't need to. She knew what people like the Thornbridges said in rooms like that, at hours like that, about women like her. She had heard versions of it her entire life, the particular vocabulary of people managing inconveniences, the language that transformed a human being into a logistical problem and then set about solving her. She had been a problem to be solved since before she could articulate what that meant, and she had survived it by becoming invisible. And invisible was the one thing she could no longer afford to be. She spent the hour before 8 o'clock doing 3 things. She made a clean copy of her most critical account figures in her smallest, most precise handwriting on 3 separate sheets of paper, which she folded and placed inside the cover of the book she carried, a volume of agricultural history she had borrowed from the library weeks ago, and which, as a result, she had a perfectly legitimate reason to be holding. She dressed with more care than usual, not elaborately. She owned nothing elaborate, but with a deliberateness that she was aware of, the specific attention a person pays to their appearance when they understand that how they carry themselves will matter today in ways it has never mattered before. And she sat at her writing desk for 5 minutes and did nothing at all except breathe and let the fear that had been circling her since 6 o'clock come close enough to look at, because she had found that fear that was acknowledged was considerably less treacherous than fear that was suppressed until it acted on its own initiative. She was afraid. She was afraid, and she was ready, and she understood, sitting in the thin October light of a room in her own house, that these 2 conditions were not contradictory. They were, in fact, the precise combination that the next several hours required. At 8 o'clock, she walked to the east drawing room. Adrian was already there. So was someone she had not expected, a man she had never seen before, perhaps 50 years old, narrow-faced and precise in his dress, with the specific bearing of a professional who has spent decades in rooms where the stakes were high and has arrived at the particular economy of manner that results. He stood near the window with a leather document satchel under his arm and the expression of a man who had ridden very fast from somewhere some distance away and had not slept much and did not particularly require sympathy about either fact. "Mr. Harwick," Adrian said to her as she entered, which was, she understood, both an introduction and an explanation. "My barrister. He arrived this morning." "Miss Vale," Mr. Harwick said with a short businesslike nod. "His Grace has told me a great deal about your work. I'd like to see the notebook if you're prepared." She handed it to him immediately. He sat down at the writing table and opened it and was quiet for several minutes, during which the only sounds in the room were the turning of pages and the distant, muffled activity of the house beginning its morning routine, footsteps, doors, the clatter from the kitchen wing, the entirely ordinary sounds of a household whose world was approximately 90 minutes from being fundamentally altered. "These cross-references," Harwick said, without looking up. "The properties on the eastern parcels, you've matched these against the library ledgers?" "The volumes from 1835 through 1841, she said. "They're still in the library. The original assessed rental values are there. And the redirect accounts. These two figures here." He turned the notebook toward her and pointed. "Gerald Thornbridge's secondary account and an account registered to a holding company," she said. "I couldn't verify the registered address of the holding company. I wrote letters." "Harwich and Sons," Harwick said, and something shifted in his face. Not surprise, because he had already known, she could see that, but the confirmation of something. "It's a shell. I've been looking at it from the London end for 6 weeks. You found it from inside the estate accounts in 4 months with no access to external records." He looked at her directly for the first time. "That's remarkable work." "Thank you," she said. "It's also," he said, closing the notebook and setting it flat on the table with both hands, "sufficient. Combined with the primary documents I've brought, and with the authenticated will," he patted the satchel, "we have enough for an immediate injunction. I filed the preliminary papers in London 3 days ago." The word injunction landed in the room with a quiet weight. Adrian had moved to stand near the fireplace, and he was watching her in the way he had, that total attention. And she looked back at him and felt the particular quality of a moment that has been building for a long time finally arriving. And she wasn't sure if what she felt was relief or something more complicated, something that didn't have a name she knew yet. "How does this proceed?" she asked Harwick. "We need to present the Thornbridge family with the documentation this morning," he said. "Formally, in the presence of witnesses. I've brought 2. They're waiting in the village." He paused. "Once they've been formally presented with the will and the fraud evidence, they have 2 options. They can contest, which they will almost certainly attempt, and which they will almost certainly lose given what you've assembled here. Or they can concede. Either way, an injunction prevents them from removing anything from the estate or liquidating any assets from this moment forward." "Gerald will contest," Adrian said from the fireplace. "Millicent will tell him not to, and he won't listen to her." "Probably," Harwick agreed, "which is, in the long term, their problem." He looked at Lydia. "What matters right now is that this happens before they have the opportunity to act on whatever they decided in that meeting this morning." "What could they do?" she said. "Legally, I mean, if they know what's coming." "Destroy documents," Harwick said simply. "The account books in the steward's office are the originals. Your notebook is a reconstruction from memory. Excellent, and largely corroborated by what I have from London, but the originals are worth having." She thought about the locked box in the steward's office, the key in the second drawer, the specific sound of the lock engaging. "I need to go back to the steward's office," she said. Both men looked at her. "I need the account books," she said, "before we do this. If Granger is told this morning to clear that office," she stopped and started again. "How long before your witnesses arrive from the village?" "An hour," Harwick said. "Perhaps less." "Then I need 40 minutes," she said. "Lydia." Adrian's voice was even, but there was something under the evenness. A restraint, the effort of a man who wished to say no. It's too dangerous, but had assessed her clearly enough to know that she had already assessed everything he was about to say. "If they see you going into that office now, they're in the breakfast room," she said. "All 4 of them. Gerald, Millicent, Lady Thornbridge, and Granger. They've been in there since 7 o'clock. She looked at him steadily. That's 40 minutes in which that office is empty and unlocked. A pause. Unlocked, he repeated. Granger was called to that meeting unexpectedly, she said. He left in a hurry last night to arrange it. Men who leave in a hurry lock their outer doors but don't always lock their inner drawers. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, 40 minutes. She was in the office in less than 5. The outer door was unlocked. She had been right about that. The inner office held the familiar organization of a fastidious man. Every surface ordered, every paper in its place, the desk clear except for a pen stand and an inkwell, and a small framed document she had never looked at closely before. She looked at it now, briefly, because something about it caught her eye. A certificate of some kind, employment credentials, issued in 1840. 1940, 2 years before her father died. She filed that and moved to the second drawer on the right. Unlocked. The key was there. She opened the box. The 4 account books sat in their usual positions, and she picked up all 4 of them because she was not in the business of half measures today. And she crossed to the window where the light was better and opened the most recent volume and spent the next 32 minutes doing what she had spent 4 months preparing herself to do, reading fast and thorough. The numbers moving through her in a current, each page confirming what she had already reconstructed and adding the specific original detail that a reconstruction could not fully replace. On page 47 of the 3rd volume, she found something she had not reconstructed, something she hadn't known to look for. She stood very still. The number on the page was not a rental figure. It was not a household account or a staff payment or a maintenance expense. It was a legal fee, a substantial one, paid in the spring of 1840 to a firm of solicitors in London, and the reference beside it in Granger's careful handwriting was 3 words: Vale Estate Matter, spring of 1840. Her father had died in November of 1840. She looked at the date again. March of 1840, 8 months before his death, a substantial legal fee paid from the Ravenhurst estate accounts, which was to say, paid for money that belonged to the estate, to a London solicitor's firm for something described as the Vale Estate Matter. Her mind moved through the implications with the speed she had always had for this kind of thing, the speed that had once seemed merely useful and now felt like the most important thing about her. A legal fee paid 8 months before her father's death, from accounts belonging to an estate that should not have been under Thornbridge management at all until after his death, for something explicitly described as being related to the Vale estate. They had known before he died, not just that he had a will, they had known the contents of the will, or close enough to the contents that they had begun managing the situation 8 months in advance. They had hired a solicitor. They had begun laying groundwork. They had looked at a dying man's estate and a young woman he'd never publicly acknowledged, and they had done the arithmetic, and they had decided, 8 months before he was in the ground, that the solution was available and worth pursuing. She thought about her father in the last months of his life. She had not been with him. She had been in Devonshire, at her second posting, and he had not sent for her, which had been entirely consistent with his behavior toward her, and which she had processed a long time ago through all the stages of grief that produced not peace, but a functional, working accommodation. She had thought he simply hadn't thought of her. She had thought she simply hadn't mattered enough. But he had left her everything. He had left her everything, and someone had known he would, and that someone had begun managing the consequences before he was cold. She stood in the steward's office with the account book open in her hands, and felt something she had not felt since she was a girl. Not fear, not fury. Something older and more fundamental, the thing that lives beneath both. The deep animal knowledge that something has been done to you that was deliberate and calculated and required the sustained effort of multiple people over multiple years. They had not simply inherited a situation. They had engineered one. She closed the account book. She took all 4 volumes and walked back down the corridor and up the stairs to the east drawing room, where Harwick was reviewing documents and Adrian stood at the window. And when he turned and saw her face, he straightened slightly, not in alarm but in a particular quality of attention, as though something in her bearing had told him, before she spoke, that she had found more than she'd gone for. "There's more," she said. She set the account books on the table and opened the third volume to page 47 and put her finger on the entry and looked at Harwick. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, March 1840. Yes, she said. He looked up at Adrian. Adrian was looking at the entry in the account book, and something had moved in his face, something that went past professional calculation into something personal, a brief, vivid signal of an emotion he did not display in general circulation. His jaw had tightened fractionally. His eyes, when he looked up, had gone to a quality of cold that she associated with the deep-water color of them and had not seen fully deployed until this moment. They knew, she said, because someone needed to say it clearly. Before he died. They were already preparing. Yes, Adrian said quietly. I suspected it. I didn't have proof. He looked at the page. Now we do. Does it change the legal position? She asked Harwick. It strengthens it considerably, Harwick said. Fraud established before the testator's death. That moves this from suppression of a will into something rather more serious. He paused. It also explains several things I've been puzzling over from the London end of this. The speed with which the estate passed into informal Thornbridge management. The lack of any formal probate challenge from your father's legitimate heirs. He looked at Lydia. Were you ever contacted by your father's solicitors after his death? No, she said. You should have been, Harwick said simply. As a named beneficiary. The failure to contact you was either negligence or design, and given, he gestured at the account book, I think we can establish which. She thought about 16-year-old Lydia Vale in Devonshire, told by the household she served that a gentleman of her acquaintance had died and that no arrangements had been made for her. She thought about the woman who had come to tell her, an older servant, apologetic in the way of people delivering news that they know is worse than they have been told to make it sound, and the careful, limited version of the information that had been provided. No arrangements. Not, your father died and left everything to you. Not, there is a will, a solicitor, a legal process underway. Not, you are owed something. Just, he is gone, and nothing has been provided, and here's the shape of the life you will continue to live. She had been 23 years old before she stood in the house she owned and heard the truth. She looked at the account book page one more time, and then she closed it with a deliberateness that was not anger and not grief, and was something she decided she would not name until later, when there was time for naming. When do your witnesses arrive? She said to Harwick. They should be at the manor within the half hour, he said. Then we need to be downstairs in 30 minutes, she said. Lydia. Adrian's voice, the quality of it, the directness that had nothing to do with rank or performance, made her look at him. Whatever you need before this happens, I'm ready, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. At 9:30 in the morning, in the east drawing room of Ravenhurst Manor, the door opened and Gerald Thornbridge walked in, expecting, she gathered from his expression, to find a servant who needed to be managed and a situation that could still be controlled. He found Lydia Vale standing at the writing table. Beside her stood a barrister with a leather document satchel and two formally dressed witnesses she had never seen before. Behind her, near the fireplace, stood the Duke of Blackmore with his arms loose at his sides and his face carrying the particular composure of a man who has arrived at the end of a long process and is prepared to complete it. Gerald stopped in the doorway. The journey his expression made in the subsequent 3 seconds was remarkable. From the bland management face he'd brought with him, through surprise, through a recalibration that tried to reassemble itself into the management face and failed, into something that was not quite fear, but was the precursor to it. What? He started. Please sit down, Mr. Thornbridge, Harwick said pleasantly, and perhaps ask your mother and Mrs. Thornbridge to join us. This concerns them as well. Gerald looked at Adrian. Blackmore, what is this? This, Adrian said with perfect calm, is a legal presentation. Mr. Harwick will explain. He stood there for a moment. She could see him calculating, could see the specific arithmetic of a man measuring what he knows against what he can't yet see. And then he turned and went back into the corridor, and she heard his voice and Millicent's voice, and then Lady Thornbridge's, and the quality of the sounds, the pitch, the pace, the jagged interruption of Gerald's explanation, told her that all three of them understood by the time they entered the room that this was not a situation they could still manage. They came in. Gerald first, then Millicent, then Lady Thornbridge, who closed the door behind her with a deliberateness that suggested she found the quality of her composure worth preserving even now. Granger was not present. She had not expected him to be. The six of them stood in the room, and Harwick opened his satchel, and the next 15 minutes contained the most concentrated legal language Lydia had ever heard, delivered in Harwick's unhurried professional monotone, while the Thornbridge family stood in front of her, and the world they had built on her dispossession was presented to them in document form. She watched their faces. Lady Thornbridge's was the most instructive. Gerald had gone white, and then a particular shade of gray. Millicent's face had closed entirely, all expression withdrawn behind a surface that was smooth and gave nothing. But Lady Thornbridge, who had sat rigid in her high-backed chair for 3 years and accepted Lydia's poured tea without ever once looking at the woman who poured it, Lady Thornbridge was looking at her now, directly, with an expression that moved through several things that Lydia could not name, and arrived finally at something that was too complicated to be simple shame, but contained shame in it, the way complex weather systems contain rain. She looked back at her steadily and said nothing. "This is absurd," Gerald said when Harwick had finished. "This will is authenticated," Harwick said, "by 2 independent examiners in London, one appointed by the Chancery Court. The authentication papers are there." He indicated the third document in the stack. "We'll contest it," Gerald said. "That is your right," Harwick said. "The injunction, however, takes effect immediately upon service, which occurred when I opened this satchel in your presence. You may not remove, liquidate, or otherwise transfer any asset of the Ravenhurst estate from this point forward pending the court proceeding." "You can't simply walk into a man's house." "It is not your house," Harwick said, with the particular quiet of absolute legal certainty. "That is rather the point." The room was very still. And then Millicent Thornbridge, who had not spoken since they entered, turned to look at Lydia for the first time since the steward's office. That same calculating attention, except that what it was calculating had entirely changed. "You knew," Millicent said. "Not to the barrister, not to the Duke. To Lydia, directly." "How long?" The question had several possible answers. How long had she known about the accounts? 4 months. How long had she known about the will? 4 days. How long had she understood, in the bone-deep way that has nothing to do with legal documentation, that she had been wronged? 23 years, give or take the first 2 or 3 in which she'd been too young to formulate the concept. "Long enough," Lydia said. Millicent held her gaze. Something moved in those calculating eyes. It was not warmth, and it was not apology, and it was not entirely without respect. Then she looked away. "Gerald," she said quietly, "don't say anything else." They left the room in a way that Lydia would remember for the rest of her life. Not loudly, not with the theatrical collapse of people in stories, the weeping and the declarations and the operatic reversal. They left the way people leave when the ground has disappeared beneath them and they are operating on the pure mechanical autopilot of shock. One foot, and then the other, faces arranged into whatever expression autopilot produces, which in this case was the specific blankness of people who had not yet begun to process what had happened to them. Lady Thornbridge went last. At the door she stopped. She did not turn around. She stood in the doorway with her back to the room, and the gray October light coming through the corridor window, catching the silver of her hair, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, to no one in particular, to the room, to the air, "His eyes." She said it very quietly. "You have his eyes," she said. "I noticed it the first time you came to Ravenhurst. I didn't let myself think about what it meant." She walked out. The door swung closed behind her. Lydia stood in the room and felt the statement land in her slowly, the way very significant things land, the way the account book entry had landed, not immediately, but in sequence, implication by implication, until the full shape of it was clear. She had her father's eyes. Lady Thornbridge had known, not suspected, known from the beginning, from the first day. and had looked at those eyes and had made a different choice than the one Lydia's father had made at the end, and had kept making it for 3 years while Lydia poured her tea at the correct angle with the spoon at 4 o'clock. She stood very still. Behind her, Harwick was organizing documents with the practiced efficiency of a man concluding a professional matter. The witnesses were signing papers. The administrative machinery of the legal process was proceeding in the way that administrative machinery proceeded. Indifferent to the human architecture it was dismantling. She felt Adrian come to stand beside her, not touching, simply present, close enough that she was aware of the particular steadiness of him, the way he occupied space. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's a reasonable answer," he said. She almost smiled. Almost. "His eyes," she said, half to herself. "Yes," he said. "I noticed it 2 years ago, when your father spoke of you." He paused. He was not a man who was always able to do what he knew was right, but he knew what was right. She thought about that. She turned it over the way she turned numbers over, looking for the shape of it, where it balanced, what it proved. It didn't excuse him, but it was something, some fragment of a thing that was not nothing. "What happens now?" she said, turning to practical ground because practical ground was where she knew how to stand. "Legally. What's the sequence?" "The court proceeding will be scheduled within the month," Harwick said from the table. "Given the strength of the documentation, I expect it will be brief. The injunction holds in the meantime. The Thornbridge family is legally obligated to vacate by the order's terms. There is a 30-day period which the court can shorten if they move against the estate's assets." "Will they?" she said. "Gerald might try something impulsive," Harwick said. "Millicent won't let him." She thought about Millicent's eyes in this room, the calculating stillness, the one moment of direct acknowledgement. "No," she agreed. "She won't." She picked up the account books from the table, all 4 of them, her arms full of the physical weight of 7 years of evidence, and held them against her chest. She was standing in her drawing room. The thought arrived without fanfare, without the dramatic resonance she might have anticipated, simply a fact, observed, as clear and plain as a correctly balanced ledger. Her drawing room, her estate, her father's eyes, and his will, and 4 months of careful numbers in a small notebook, and 3 words from a man who had kept a promise long after the person he'd made it to had no way of knowing whether it had been kept. She looked at Adrian, who was watching her with the quality of attention that she had stopped trying to explain away or account for and had simply begun receiving as the specific kind of presence it was. "I'll need to learn the estate properly," she said. "All of it. The tenants, the land management, the accounts from the beginning. There's a great deal I don't know." "There's a great deal you've already taught yourself," he said. "That's not the same as knowing it." "No," he said. "It isn't, but it's a more honest starting point than most people have." She nodded. Outside the window, Ravenhurst's grounds stretched to the gray horizon. The kitchen garden, the formal hedges, the pastures and the stone walls and the tenants' cottages visible in the middle distance, smoke rising from their chimneys in the cold morning air. Her land. People who had been working her land for years without knowing it, without knowing her, and who would need to know her now. She felt the size of it. She also felt, underneath the size of it, something she had not expected to feel on a morning this fraught with legal proceedings and family confrontations, and the debris of 3 years of carefully maintained invisibility, something that her body recognized as purpose, as direction, the specific clarifying sensation of knowing exactly where you are supposed to be. She was supposed to be here. She had always been supposed to be here. The document signing took another hour. During that hour, the manor operated in the particular suspended state of a house that doesn't yet know what it is. The kitchen sent up breakfast for the witnesses. Bessie appeared at the drawing room door at some point with tea. She looked at Lydia with wide eyes, and Lydia gave her the smallest, most composed nod she could manage, and Bessie visibly exhaled and went back to the kitchen. Somewhere in the east wing, she could hear movement. Packing, she thought, or preparation for packing. The sounds of an ending. Mr. Granger appeared at the drawing-room door at 10:30. He stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has spent the morning weighing his options and has arrived at the conclusion that they are fewer than he would like. He looked at Lydia. He looked at Harwick. He looked at the documents on the table and at the account books in Lydia's arms. And then he looked back at Lydia. And in his eyes she saw the specific arithmetic of a man who has been on the wrong side of something and knows it and is now doing the calculation of consequences. "Miss Vale," he said. "Mr. Granger," she said. A pause. "The keys to the estate office," he said, and he crossed the room and set a ring of keys on the table beside her, without being asked, and walked out. She looked at the keys. She picked them up. They were heavier than she expected. A full household ring, a dozen keys at least, the accumulated material authority of the estate's management, cold iron in her palm. She closed her hand around them. At 11 o'clock, a maid she didn't recognize came to the drawing room and said, in the careful tone of someone delivering a message they have been asked to deliver precisely, "Mrs. Thornbridge asks if she could have a brief word with Miss Vale, in the morning room, at Miss Vale's convenience." Lydia looked at the ceiling briefly, then at Adrian, who gave her nothing, not guidance, not warning, just that steady attention, leaving it entirely where it belonged, which was with her. "Tell Mrs. Thornbridge I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said. He did not try to come with her. She went alone. Millicent was standing at the window of the morning room, not seated, which meant she had not been waiting long enough to have decided she was going to sit. She turned when Lydia entered, and for a moment neither woman spoke. "I want you to know," Millicent said, "that I didn't know about the March 1840 payment, the preparations before your father died." Lydia looked at her. "Gerald knew," Millicent said. "Lady Thornbridge knew. I was told, when I came to this house, that the Vale estate arrangement was legally ambiguous but settled. I was not told what the settlement cost." She paused. "I don't expect that distinction to matter to you." "It matters," Lydia said. "It doesn't change what I'll do, but it matters." Millicent nodded, once, in the way of a woman who has received something she wasn't certain she would receive and does not intend to make more of it than it is. "The children?" Millicent said. "I have 2 daughters. Whatever happens in the court proceeding, your daughters are not responsible for this," Lydia said, "and I'm not a person who punishes children." Something released in Millicent's face, a small, barely visible exhale. "Thank you," she said. She walked past Lydia to the door. At the door she stopped. The same hesitation that Lady Thornbridge had made, in the same doorway, and the parallel was not lost on her. The women of this family stopped at doors, stopped by the specific weight of things they had not said and perhaps should have. "You'll do well here," Millicent said without turning around. "Better than we did." Then she was gone. Lydia stood alone in the morning room. Her morning room, she made herself say it in her mind, plain and practiced, because she understood that the habit of ownership was something that had to be built deliberately after a lifetime of its opposite, and looked out the window at the grounds. A groom was crossing the stable yard below, leading a horse. A good horse, a bay, strong-necked and clean-legged. One of the estate horses. Hers now, in the same way the kitchen garden was hers, and the pastures, and the accounts, and the keys that were still in her hand. She opened her hand and looked at the keys. The iron was warm now from her grip. She closed her fingers around them again and turned toward the door. And then she heard it, not from inside the house, but from outside, from the direction of the front drive, a sound that did not belong to the ordinary morning, a sound that her trained-for-survival instincts catalogued before her conscious mind had fully processed it. Carriage wheels on gravel. She moved to the nearest window. A second carriage, larger, formal, black, with no visible crest, had pulled into the Ravenhurst Drive. 2 men were stepping out, dressed not in traveling clothes, but in the sober, intentional dress of men who had come somewhere for a purpose. One of them she did not know. The other one she recognized, with a shock that moved through her like cold water, because she had seen his name in the account books, on the legal fee entry, on the letterhead of the firm cited, the firm that had been paid in March of 1840 to manage the Vale estate matter before her father was even in the ground. The solicitor who had helped them bury the will had just walked onto her property. She was already moving before she had fully decided to move, out of the morning room, down the corridor, toward the front entrance, the keys in her fist and her heart knocking once, hard, in her chest. Whatever he had come to do, he had arrived 7 minutes too late. The injunction was signed. But he didn't know that yet. And in the gap between what he knew and what was already done, Lydia Vale walked toward the front door of her house with the full weight of everything she had built in 4 months of careful, invisible labor at her back. And she opened the door before the man could knock. He looked at her. "I'm here to see the Thornbridge family," he said, with the professional confidence of a man who has never once, in his career, been answered by a woman who mattered. "The Thornbridge family," she said, "is no longer in a position to receive you." He blinked. "My name is Lydia Vale," she said. "I am the owner of Ravenhurst Manor, and anything you need to say about this estate, you'll say to me." He stared at her. Behind her in the hallway, she heard Adrian's footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, each one placed like a chess piece, come to a stop a few feet back. Not intervening, present, witness. She stood in her doorway and held the man's gaze and did not move. The morning light fell on both of them equally, and the keys were warm in her hand, and the drive stretched out behind the solicitor's carriage all the way to the public road, and beyond the road the moors, and beyond the moors. England in its October gray, enormous and indifferent, and entirely unaware that something very small and very significant had just happened in this doorway. A woman had stopped being managed, and the man on her doorstep had not yet understood what that meant. But he would. She would make certain of it. The solicitor's name was Pemberton. She learned this in the first 30 seconds because he introduced himself with the automatic confidence of a man who expected his name to function as a credential. Pemberton, of Pemberton and Associates, London. And she watched his face as he said it, and watched the specific moment when he realized, from the quality of her response, that she already knew who he was. That moment was a small gift, and she accepted it without expression. "Come in, Mr. Pemberton," she said, and stood back from the door. He came in because men like Pemberton always came in. They were constitutionally incapable of remaining on doorsteps when invited inside, because doorsteps were for other people, for the managed and the dismissed, and they had not yet processed the possibility that the invitation itself was a controlled environment. She led him to the east drawing room, where Harwick was still organizing the last of his documents, and the two witnesses were buttoning their coats, and she set him down in a chair across from the writing table and sat across from him and folded her hands and waited. He looked at Harwick. Harwick looked at him with the mild professional recognition of a man who has encountered opposing counsel in some form before. "Mr. Harwick," Pemberton said, and the single word contained approximately 40 years of legal fraternity calculation. "Mr. Pemberton," Harwick said pleasantly, "rather a long ride from London." "I was retained to advise the Thornbridge family on a matter of some urgency," Pemberton said, shifting his attention back to Lydia with the adjustment of a man recalibrating his approach. "I understood the situation to be in flux." "The situation," Lydia said, "is resolved. Mr. Harwick can provide you with the documentation." "Miss Vale." He said her name with the specific cadence, not hostile, not yet, the professional warmth of a man who has built a career on making people feel that their interests are being handled. "I think it might be worth discussing what resolution actually serves everyone involved. Your father's estate is complex. The authenticated will is a beginning, certainly, but the legal proceeding ahead of you will be prolonged and costly, and there may be arrangements that would give you a satisfactory outcome without—" "Without what?" she said. He paused. "Without the disruption," he said, "of a full public proceeding." She looked at him for a moment. "You've come to offer me a settlement," she said. "I've come," he said carefully, "to explore whether a settlement might serve your interests." "My interests," she said, "are the full legal title to Ravenhurst Manor and its associated holdings, the recovery of 7 years of misappropriated estate income, and the formal establishment of my identity as the acknowledged daughter and heir of the 4th Earl of Ashcroft." She paused. "Which interests, specifically, did you imagine a settlement would satisfy?" The room was very quiet. Harwick had stopped organizing documents. Pemberton looked at her with the expression of a man who had arrived expecting a negotiation and was discovering that what he was actually participating in was a conclusion. "The recovery amount you're describing," he said, "given the 7-year figure, is documented in those 4 account books," she said, and indicated them, still on the table where she had set them. Page by page, quarter by quarter, cross-referenced and corroborated. Mr. Harwick has the London End documentation. Between the 2 sets of records, there is no amount in dispute. There is only the amount. Pemberton looked at the account books. She watched him do the arithmetic she had done and arrive at roughly the same number, and she watched what the number did to his composure. Not breaking it, he was too practiced for that, but straining it fractionally in the way that large numbers strain things. "The Thornbridge family's liquid assets," he said, and stopped. "Are significantly less than what was taken," she said. "Yes, I know, which is why the estate itself, the land, the properties, the holdings, forms the recovery basis, not simply the liquid accounts." She had discussed this with Harwick at 6:30 that morning in the 20 minutes before Pemberton's carriage appeared, and she had understood it quickly and completely because she had spent 4 months learning the specific architecture of what had been done, and therefore understood exactly what undoing it required. "Mr. Pemberton, you were paid in March of 1840 to help suppress a will before the testator died. That payment appears in the estate account books. Whatever you were retained to negotiate today, I think you understand that you are not in a position to negotiate from the Thornbridge side of this." The silence that followed was of a particular quality. The silence of a man calculating whether what he is about to say will improve or worsen a situation that is already, he is beginning to understand, significantly worse than he was told when he got into his carriage that morning. He looked at Harwick. "Is she represented?" "By me," Harwick said, with what Lydia was fairly certain was a suppressed satisfaction. "From this morning." Pemberton picked up his hat from the arm of the chair. "I'll need to confer with my clients," he said. "Of course," Lydia said. "You'll find them in the East Wing. They've been advised not to leave the manor pending the court schedule, though they are free to do so if they choose to waive the cooperation provision." She stood as he stood, the natural authority of a host concluding an interview. "I'll have someone show you the way." She walked to the door and opened it, and Bessie was in the corridor. Not by coincidence, because nothing was coincidence today, she had asked her to be available. And she asked her to show the gentleman to the East Wing, and she stood in the doorway and watched Pemberton walk away down the corridor of her house, and she breathed once, slowly, and turned back to the room. Adrian was leaning against the window frame with his arms crossed. "You didn't tell me about the 1840 payment until this morning," he said. Not an accusation, an observation with a question embedded in it. "I found it this morning," she said, "in the account books. And you used it in a live conversation with the man who received that payment," he said, 90 minutes after finding it. "It seemed relevant," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention that she had stopped trying to catalog and had simply started accepting as a feature of being in his vicinity, like warmth from a fire. "It was relevant," he said. "It was also very well done." She sat down in the nearest chair because her legs had been performing structural integrity under considerable pressure for the last 3 hours, and she was going to let them rest for 5 minutes. "He'll advise them to concede," Harwick said from the table, closing his satchel with finality. "He has no choice. The 1840 payment makes his own position untenable if this goes to full proceeding. His best outcome is a rapid, quiet settlement that doesn't require him to explain his conduct to the court." "Which means they'll concede," Lydia said. "Within the week," Harwick said. "Possibly sooner." She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Then she opened them. "What do I need to do?" she said. "Between now and then?" "Nothing legal," Harwick said. "I handle the proceeding from here. What you need to do is begin establishing yourself in the manor, practically, visibly. The more settled the occupancy, the cleaner the court record." She nodded. She looked at the room she was sitting in, the East drawing room, with its high ceiling and its good fireplace and its windows facing the garden, and she thought about what establishing herself meant in the most practical terms possible, and she felt the size of the task not as a weight, but as a set of specific, addressable problems, which was the only way she had ever been able to approach anything. "I'll need to speak to the staff," she said. She called the household staff together at noon. They came to the main hall. 10 people in total, ranging from Bessie at 17 to the head cook, Mrs. Farnham, who was 64 and had been at Ravenhurst since before anyone currently living there could remember. They stood in an arrangement that reflected the hierarchy of below-stairs service. The senior staff near the front, the junior maids toward the back, all of them with the collective expression of people who have been told something significant is happening and have not yet been told what. Lydia stood in front of them. She had not prepared a speech. She had not thought about this moment in terms that required a speech. She had thought about it in terms of what these people needed to know and what they needed, practically, from the woman who was now responsible for their employment, their wages, and the management of the household they lived and worked in. "Most of you know who I am," she said. "I've been Lady Thornbridge's companion for 3 years. What most of you didn't know, what I didn't fully know myself until recently, is that Ravenhurst Manor belongs to me. My father left it to me in his will. The legal process to formalize that is underway, and I expect it to conclude within the week." She looked at them. Some of them had known something was happening. The staff always knew something was happening before the principals did, because the staff moved through every room of the house while the principals stayed in their designated spaces. She could see it in the faces of the senior staff, not surprise, but a careful attention, a listening quality that was trying to determine what this meant for them specifically. "I want to be direct about what changes and what doesn't," she said. "Your employment continues. Your wages continue, and I intend to review them, because I have looked at the estate accounts, and I know what the household staff has been paid for the last 7 years, and I know what the estate income supports, and there is a discrepancy that I intend to correct." She paused, letting that land. "What changes is the management of the estate. Mr. Granger will be transitioning out of his position. I'll be taking direct responsibility for the estate accounts, at least initially, with the support of a qualified estate manager I'll be identifying." Mrs. Farnham, in the front of the group, had the expression of a woman absorbing significant information with exceptional discipline. "Questions," Lydia said, "if you have them." A young footman named Thomas, who she had spoken to perhaps 3 times in 3 years, raised his hand with the slight awkwardness of someone not entirely certain whether hand-raising was appropriate. "Miss Vale, the Thornbridge family, are they—" "They'll be leaving the manor," she said. 30 days, as required by the court order, after which Ravenhurst will be operating as my household." She looked at him directly. "I know some of you have worked for the Thornbridge family for a long time, and this is a significant change. If anyone chooses not to stay under new management, I'll understand that, and I'll make sure your references are in order." No one moved. Bessie, in the back, was looking at her with the wide, luminous eyes of someone watching something they have privately hoped for without knowing they were hoping for it. "That's all for now," Lydia said. "I'll speak with each of you individually over the coming days. Thank you." They dispersed, not the way people disperse when a meeting is simply over, but with the slightly altered quality of motion that people have when something is shifted in their understanding of a place, like a room rearranged while you slept, familiar but newly organized. Mrs. Farnham did not disperse. She waited until the others had gone, standing at the foot of the stairs with the stillness of a woman who has decided that something needs to be said and is going to say it. "Mrs. Farnham," Lydia said. "Miss Vale." The cook looked at her with the expression of someone who has been in service for 40 years and has seen a great deal of variation in how houses are run and has opinions about it. "Your father visited this house once, 6 years ago. Lady Thornbridge had a dinner. He stayed 2 nights. Lydia was still. "I know because I cooked for him," Mrs. Farnham said simply. "He asked me the name of the kitchen garden and whether the south beds had been replanted, because he remembered them from his own visits here as a young man. He was a gentleman who paid attention to the right things." She paused. "You look like him." "So I've been told," Lydia said quietly. "I'm glad you're here," Mrs. Farnham said, with the directness of a woman who does not invest words unnecessarily and therefore means everyone she uses. "I'll have lunch ready at 1 o'clock. She went back to the kitchen. Lydia stood in the main hall of her house and looked at the staircase. The broad, well-made staircase with the carved newel post and the runner that needed replacing and the north-facing window at the landing that let in a specific quality of light at this hour, and felt something she was beginning to identify, carefully, as home. The afternoon was work. She had known it would be, had expected, in fact, that this was where the real weight would reveal itself, not in the confrontation, not in the legal process, but here, in the specific material task of understanding what she had inherited. She started with the estate office. With the account books now in her possession and Granger no longer in the building, he had left quietly, mid-afternoon, with a single bag and no ceremony. She sat at the steward's desk for the first time with full access to every drawer and every file, and she began. Not reading for evidence now, not reconstructing or cross-referencing, reading to understand. The estate as it actually was. The tenants, the land management practices, the maintenance histories, the staff records, the income streams and the expenditure patterns, and the accumulated decisions of 7 years of management by people who had been primarily interested in extraction rather than cultivation. Adrian appeared at the office doorway at 3:30, carrying 2 cups of tea, which she found she was simultaneously amused by and deeply grateful for. "Harwick has gone to the village," he said, setting a cup beside her. "He'll send the final documents by tomorrow morning." "Thank you," she said, "for the tea and for the information equally." He looked at the spread of files across the desk. 7 years of estate records, organized in the sequence she was working through. "How bad is it?" he said. "The land management is poor," she said. "The eastern pastures have been under-rotated for at least 4 years. They'll need to come out of production for a season, which means the tenants on those parcels need alternative arrangements." She turned a page. "The roof on the north wing has a maintenance record that stopped 2 years ago, which means either the repairs were made and not recorded, or they weren't made at all. We can find out which by going to the north wing," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was going to do that this afternoon." "I'll come with you," he said. She looked up at him. There was something in the offer, not the legal and strategic partnership of the last several days, which had its own quality, but something more ordinary and therefore somehow more significant. A man offering to walk through a house with her to look at a roof. The specific, undecorated utility of someone who intends to continue being present after the crisis has passed. She had not had much experience of that. "All right," she said. The north wing roof was not good. They stood in the attic corridor and looked at the evidence of 2 years of deferred maintenance, the water damage, the compromised beams, the particular smell of wet timber that has been wet too long. And Lydia looked at it with the same systematic attention she brought to ledger pages, identifying priorities, calculating sequences. "The 2 central beams are the urgent problem," she said. "The rest can be managed through the winter if we address those first." "I know a builder in the county," Adrian said. "Good man, reliable. He can be here by the end of the week." She looked at him briefly. "You know a builder?" "I've repaired 3 roofs in the last 6 years," he said, with the slight dryness of someone reporting facts about hardship without requesting sympathy for them. "You develop resources." She turned back to the beams and was quiet for a moment. "You've been managing your own estates alone," she said, "since Eleanor died." "Yes. That's a considerable amount of work." "It is," he said. "Though I've found—" He paused, choosing words with the care he consistently brought to things he actually meant, that work of that kind is not entirely without benefit. When everything else is uncertain, a roof that needs repairing is a concrete problem. Concrete problems have solutions. She understood that absolutely. She had spent 4 months and most of her life operating on exactly that principle. "I used to think it was a limitation," she said, "the way my mind goes to the practical thing. People who feel things more openly. I thought they were getting something I wasn't getting." "And now?" he said. She looked at the damaged beams. "Now I think it's just a different language for the same experience. The practical thing is how I feel the feeling." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." They stood in the attic corridor in the gray afternoon light, the smell of old timber and rain-damp plaster around them, and the quality of the silence between them had shifted from what it had been Even that morning, something had settled in it, or some distance had been crossed that neither of them had marked at the exact moment of crossing. She was aware of it without looking at him. She was fairly certain he was aware of it too. "We should finish the lower floors before the light goes," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and they went back down the stairs. By evening, the Thornbridge family had retreated almost entirely to the east wing. The dinner table that night was different from every dinner that had preceded it in 3 years, not because of the food, or the hour, or the physical arrangement of the room, but because of the distribution of presents within it. Lydia sat at the head of the table. Adrian sat to her right. Harwick's witnesses had remained for the night, occupying 2 of the guest rooms, and they sat further down the table in the comfortable, professionally neutral manner of people who are present in an official capacity and have learned to eat dinner competently in all kinds of situations. No Thornbridge family member joined them. This was information. She had not excluded them. There had been no formal rearrangement of the dinner arrangement, no instruction given. They had simply not come, and their absence said everything about their assessment of the new order that a formal statement could not have conveyed more clearly. They understood that something had changed, that the change was not reversible, that the person at the head of the table was no longer the companion standing at the sideboard. Bessie served the soup with the slightly elevated energy of someone who has been waiting for this specific moment without knowing they were waiting for it, and Mrs. Farnham had, without being asked, produced a dinner that was considerably better than what the household usually managed on a Tuesday, which Lydia understood as a statement of institutional loyalty and received accordingly. "The tenant situation," she said to Adrian over the soup, because dinner for her was not a reprieve from the work, but a continuation of it in a different form. "The eastern parcels. I want to speak with those tenants directly. Not through a steward, myself." He looked at her with the slight quality of someone adjusting an expectation, not surprise. He had stopped being surprised by her, she thought, or rather he had established an expectation that was set high enough that most things landed within it. "That's not conventional," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I've been looking at the maintenance of those parcels and the rental rates and the gap between what was collected and what was supposed to be collected, and I think those tenants have been dealing with a management situation that I would prefer to understand from their perspective before I make decisions about how to correct it." "They may not speak to you openly," he said. "Tenants are cautious with landlords, especially new ones." "I know," she said, "but I was the companion to the woman they believed was the landlord for 3 years. Some of them may have spoken to me in the village or at the estate gates. I'm not entirely a stranger." He considered this. "When?" "Thursday," she said. "I want the account review finished first." He nodded, accepting the logic, and returned to his soup. And across the table, one of the witnesses was asking Harwick about the route back to London, and the conversation moved on. And Lydia sat at the head of her table and ate her dinner and let the specific, improbable reality of the evening settle into her bones. The letter came on Wednesday morning. It was from Gerald Thornbridge, delivered to the estate office door by a footman, written in Gerald's hand on heavy cream paper that she recognized from the household supply. Short, 3 sentences. She read it standing at the desk, and then sat down and read it again, slowly. "Miss Vale, our solicitor advises that we will not be contesting the proceeding. We ask only for the courtesy of the 30-day transition period to arrange our affairs. G. Thornbridge." She set it down. She sat with it for a long time, not because the content required long sitting, because it didn't. It was entirely expected, and Harwick had predicted it, but because of what it represented, which was not merely a legal capitulation, but something more personal and less tidy. 3 sentences from a man who had benefited for 7 years from what had been done to her, and who was now, with 3 sentences, attempting to step back from it to a position of civilized transaction. She thought about the 30 days ahead, the Thornbridge family moving through rooms they no longer owned, gathering objects from spaces that were no longer theirs, navigating the specific humiliation of departure from a place that had defined their identity. She had not expected to feel anything particular about this. She was surprised to find that she felt something. Not sympathy exactly, not satisfaction, though there was satisfaction present, the legitimate satisfaction of a wrong being corrected. Something more complicated. the specific emotional texture of a person who has been treated as nothing, looking at the people who did the treating and finding them, now, diminished. Not vicious, simply diminished. Smaller than the threat they had represented, reduced by exposure to their actual size. She wrote a reply in her own hand. Mr. Thornbridge, the 30-day period is confirmed. The transition will be conducted respectfully. L. Vale. She folded it and gave it to the footman. Then she picked up the account book she had been working through and continued. On Thursday, she went to the Eastern parcels. She drove herself in the smaller gig. She had not yet organized a formal schedule with the stable, and driving herself had the additional advantage of arriving without announcement, which was the form of arrival she had always found most instructive. She wore her good wool coat, which was the best thing she owned, and she carried her notebook, and she drove through the October morning with the moors wide on either side and the stone walls of the Ravenhurst land marking her route, and she felt, for the first time in years, the specific sensation of moving through the world as herself, rather than as an absence. The first tenant farm belonged to a family named Calwick, father, adult son, daughter-in-law, and 3 children, working 30 acres on the eastern slope. The father, Robert Calwick, came to the yard gate when he heard the gig and looked at her with the expression of a man who is trying to assess a situation before committing to a position. Miss Vale, he said, because evidently her name had preceded her, which meant news moved faster through the tenancy than she had estimated. Mr. Calwick, she said, I wanted to speak with you about the farm. Would you be willing to give me 20 minutes? He looked at her for a long moment. The weathered, direct assessment of a man who has spent his life reading conditions and making decisions based on what he reads. Then he opened the gate. Come in, then, he said. She spent an hour there, not 20 minutes. The son, a man named Daniel, perhaps 30, with his father's directness and a more openly skeptical quality, joined them after the first 10 minutes, and between the 3 of them, she collected more information about the actual management state of the eastern parcels than 2 days of account book reading had provided. The pasture rotation had been cut not from incompetence, but from instruction. Granger had specifically told them, 4 years ago, to reduce the fallow cycle, because the estate needed the short-term rental income from fields that should have been resting. The tenants had known it was wrong. They had said so. They had been told to do it anyway. The drainage on the south edge, Daniel Calwick said, at some point in the middle of their conversation, with the quality of someone raising something they have been raising for a long time to audiences that did not listen. It's been failing for 2 years. When it fails completely, we lose the lower 5 acres to standing water. I saw it in the maintenance records, she said. Or rather, I saw the absence of it in the maintenance records. He looked at her. The skepticism in his face was not gone, but it had shifted. From the skepticism of a man who has decided not to invest belief in a situation that will not reward it, to the more cautious skepticism of a man who is receiving evidence that this situation might be different from the previous ones and is not yet willing to trust that evidence but is at least considering it. How much would fix it, she said. He told her a number. It was not a large number relative to the estate's income. It was, she suspected, a number that had been presented to the previous estate management and dismissed because it required spending money to maintain land rather than simply extracting from it. I'll have it addressed before the winter ground freeze, she said. He looked at his father. His father looked at her. You'll send someone, Daniel said, the specific inflection of someone who has been told things before. I'll come myself to confirm it's been done, she said, when it's complete. Another look between the 2 men. This one different from the first. A calibration. All right then, Robert Calwick said, with the weight of a man making a decision that he is prepared to revise if it turns out to be the wrong one, and the specific quality of a man who has not made a trusting decision in a long time and is finding it unfamiliar on his tongue. She drove to 3 more farms that afternoon. At each one, the story was variations on the same theme. Maintenance deferred, pastures pushed too hard, small improvements withheld, grievances raised and unaddressed. At each one she listened completely, took notes, made specific commitments that she wrote down in their presence so they could see that the words were being recorded, and asked a question that no one apparently had thought to ask them before. What does this land need that it hasn't been getting? She drove back to the manor in the late afternoon with a notebook full of specific, actionable information and the particular kind of tiredness that comes from sustained, genuine attention. The tiredness that means you were fully present, not the exhaustion of performance. Adrian was at the front of the house when she returned, speaking with the builder he had apparently already contacted, a solid man named Garrett, who was looking up at the north wing roofline with the professional assessment of someone who knows what he's looking at. Adrian turned when he heard the gig on the drive and watched her pull up, and something in the way he looked at her. The specific quality of his attention at this distance, across the gravel drive in the late October light, had the character of someone recognizing a thing they had been watching for and were glad to see. "How were the farms?" he said, when she came within speaking distance. "Honest," she said. "And worse than the account suggested, which is saying something." He introduced her to Garrett, who gave her the same professional directness he'd been giving the roofline, and she walked the north wing with both of them, while Garrett explained his plan in the practical language of a man who respected people who could follow technical explanations and had decided from a 5-minute acquaintance that she was one of them. She liked him immediately. 3 weeks, Garrett said at the end of the walk. "If the weather holds." "What if the weather doesn't hold?" she said. 4 weeks, he said simply. "But the critical beams I can do in 5 days. That's your winter shelter." "Start Monday," she said. He nodded and went to speak to one of his men who had accompanied him, and she stood in the cold late afternoon with Adrian beside her and looked up at the roofline. The thing that needed doing, the specific problem with the specific solution, the manor that was hers being tended to at last. "Pemberton will have advised them to sign the concession papers by Friday," Adrian said. "Gerald's letter said they won't contest," she said. "It came this morning." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me." "I told you now," she said. Another moment. "And?" he said. She considered the question, the full weight of it, everything it was asking about how she was carrying this, what it felt like to stand at the end of a week that had dismantled and rebuilt her entire life. "I went to 4 farms today," she said. "I have a full notebook of work to do, and a builder starting Monday, and an estate that hasn't been properly managed in 7 years. She looked at him. "I feel—" She paused, choosing with care, "as though I've been walking in the wrong direction for a very long time, and someone turned me around and now I can see the distance I have to cover. It's a lot of distance." "Yes," he said. "But it's the right direction," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the fading light, and there was something in his face that had been building over the course of the week, gathering in the specific way that things gather when they are real and not performed, not announced but present, patient, entirely legible to someone who was paying attention. She was paying attention. "The legal process will conclude next week," he said. "After that, my presence here has no formal reason behind it." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I find," he said carefully, "that I am not particularly interested in leaving." The wind moved across the drive, carrying the smell of the moors and cold stone and the particular clean emptiness of October, and the builder's men were talking somewhere around the corner of the house, and the light was going fast the way October light did, all at once, as though it changed its mind. "The North Wing study," she said after a moment. "I've been thinking it needs reorganizing. The previous arrangement was not well thought out." "I could help with that," he said. "You have good instincts about rooms," she said. "I've noticed." "Have you?" he said, and the dryness in it was so faint it was almost not there at all. "Stay through the month," she said. "There's a great deal of practical work, and I could use—" She paused. "Someone who knows what they're doing." It was, she was aware, possibly the least romantically framed invitation in the history of invitations. He appeared to find it entirely sufficient. "Through the month," he said. "Yes." She turned toward the house. Her house, she said it again, plain and practiced, the habit of ownership being built one repetition at a time. And he walked beside her, and at the front door she stopped and turned and looked back at the manor grounds. The drive, the garden wall, the moors beyond, the last of the copper light lying flat across the stone. Somewhere in the east wing, the Thornbridge family was packing. In the kitchen, Mrs. Farnham was making dinner. In the village, a builder had a job starting Monday. In 4 farms on the eastern parcels, men were telling their families about the conversation they'd had with the new mistress of Ravenhurst, and the families were listening, and the families were deciding what to make of it, and the verdict was not yet in. These things took time, required consistency, had to be earned through the long, undramatic accumulation of promises kept. But the first stone of that foundation had been laid today, and in the attic of the north wing, 2 beams needed fixing. She turned back to the door. "Come in," she said, "before we lose the light entirely." He followed her inside, and the door closed behind them, and somewhere above the manor the first stars appeared in the October dark, indifferent and bright. The same stars that had looked down on this house when it was her father's, and before that, and would go on looking down long after all of them were gone. But tonight they looked down on Ravenhurst in its new arrangement, and the name on the deed, and the woman who had found her way home through 7 years of someone else's design, and the long, specific, unhurried work that was only just beginning. It was, she thought, enough. For tonight, it was more than enough. The month moved the way October always did in the north, fast and cold, and entirely without sentiment, stripping the trees back to their honest structure, burning the last of the warmth out of the stone walls until the manor held its chill from morning through to evening, and the fires became less amenity than necessity. Lydia did not mind the cold. She had grown up in drafty rooms and learned early that warmth was something you generated from the inside, and the inside lately had more to generate with than it ever had before. She worked from 7 in the morning until the light failed, and sometimes after, by lamplight, at the estate office desk that had been Granger's and was now so thoroughly hers that she could not remember, practically, what it had looked like when it belonged to someone else. The files were reorganized. The account system was rebuilt. Not just the current records, but the entire structure, redesigned from the logic of someone who understood what the accounts were actually for, which was to tell you the truth about the land rather than to obscure it. The builder Garrett and his men had the critical north wing beams repaired in 4 days. She went up to see them on the 5th morning before Garrett arrived and stood in the attic corridor and looked at the new timber, clean, solid, properly seated, and felt the particular satisfaction of a building being cared for. She left before Garrett got there, because the satisfaction was private, and she had not yet worked out how to share it without it sounding like something other than what it was, which was simply the feeling of a thing done right. The eastern pasture drainage problem was addressed in the 2nd week by a contractor from the village who had been waiting, apparently, for the estate to allow him the work he had offered to do for 2 years. He finished in 3 days. She drove out to the Calwick farm on the 4th day and walked the south edge with Daniel Calwick in the morning mud, and they stood at the drainage outlet together and watched the water move the way it was supposed to move, clean and directed, and Daniel looked at it for a long time without speaking. "All right," he said finally, with the inflection that she recognized as his version of significant approval. "Good," she said. They walked back to the farm in a silence that was different from the silence of their first meeting, less watchful, more companionable, the silence of 2 people who have established a working trust and find it comfortable enough not to need filling. "My father wants to know," Daniel said at the gate, "whether you'll be wanting to expand the cattle numbers on the lower pasture next spring. The grazing's been light since the rotation change." "Yes," she said immediately, because she had been looking at exactly this question in the accounts for a week and had already arrived at the answer. "I'll need to discuss it with you and your father properly. The carrying capacity, the management schedule. Can I come Thursday?" "Thursday," he said. "Yes." She drove back to the manor and wrote Thursday, Calwick, cattle expansion in her notebook, and turned the page. The court proceeding took place in the 2nd week of November. She had expected it to feel larger. She had expected, perhaps, a formal confrontation. The Thornbridge family, the judge, the documents, the specific theater of justice being publicly administered. What she got was considerably less dramatic and considerably more thorough. A 2-hour session in a county courtroom that smelled of wood polish and old paper, with Harwick presenting documents in his unhurried professional monotone while a judge listened and made notes, and a solicitor representing the Thornbridge family, not Pemberton, who had declined to appear in the proceedings he had been paid to help create, making objections that Harwick addressed with the patient efficiency of a man removing obstacles from a path that was already clear. Gerald Thornbridge was present, as required. He sat across the room with the particular stillness of a man who has been advised to say nothing and is finding the advice the hardest thing he has ever followed. Lydia sat beside Harwick. She was aware of Gerald's presence the way you are aware of weather, as a condition, something you have accounted for, something that requires appropriate preparation and does not otherwise demand your full attention. She spent most of the 2 hours watching the judge, reading his face the way she read accounts, looking for the places where the information landed and what it produced, building an assessment from the accumulated evidence of expression and posture, and the specific quality of the silences between one document being set down and the next being lifted. He was a careful man. That was the main thing she concluded. He read everything fully before he moved on, and he asked 2 questions, both of them directed at Harwick, both of them about the authentication of the will, and both questions were answered completely, and he nodded once after each answer with the nod of a man ticking items off an internal list. When it was done, he looked up. The will of Edmund Vale, 4th Earl of Ashcroft, is hereby authenticated and confirmed as the governing instrument for the disposition of the Ravenhurst estate and associated holdings, he said. Miss Lydia Vale is established as the sole heir and legal owner of the estate in its entirety. The fraud claims are referred to the appropriate authority for further proceeding. He looked at the Thornbridge solicitor. Your clients have 30 days to complete their removal from the premises, as previously agreed. He set down his papers and looked over his glasses at the room. Is there anything further? There was nothing further. She stood outside the courthouse afterward in the November wind with Harwick beside her, and the legal title to Ravenhurst in her hands, not metaphorically, the actual document, heavy cream paper with the court seal, and she looked at it. She had expected to feel something enormous. She had expected the weight of it to correspond to the 7 years of its suppression. What she felt was quieter than that. A deep, specific settling, the sensation of a thing that has been wrong for a long time being put right. Not a sudden corrective force, but a slow, deliberate re-leveling, like a floor being made true. It did not undo what had been done. It could not restore the years. But it was real, and it was documented, and it was done. Congratulations, Miss Vale, Harwick said. Thank you, she said, for everything. He nodded with the professional brevity of a man who considered the job its own reward and found sentiment about it unnecessary, which she respected entirely. She looked up at the courthouse facade, the plain stone, the institutional windows, the authority of the structure that had, on this particular morning, done exactly what such structures were supposed to do. Adrian was waiting with the carriage at the foot of the courthouse steps. He did not ask how it went. He could see how it went from her face and the document in her hands, and he simply opened the carriage door and she got in, and he got in after her, and the carriage moved off through the county town streets, while the November wind pushed leaves along the gutters, and the first real cold of the season settled into the stone of the buildings. She looked at the document. It's done, she said. Yes, he said. She folded the document once and held it in her lap and looked out the carriage window at the town moving past. The shops, the people, the ordinary morning continuing as it had before and would after, indifferent to the specifically extraordinary thing that had just happened in the room above the stone steps. He was here, she said. My father. He came to the county town. Mrs. Farnham told me he visited Ravenhurst once 6 years ago. He would have driven this road. Yes, Adrian said. He visited several times over the years. He loved the land. She thought about that. A man who loved a piece of land, who visited it and asked about the kitchen garden and remembered the south beds, who at the end of his life made the only honest document he ever made in relation to her and directed it to the right place, and then died before he could ensure it arrived. Did he know, she said, that they would suppress it? Adrian was quiet for a moment. I don't think he knew the Thornbridge family would do what they did specifically, he said. I think he knew that the people around him were capable of it. He trusted me with his intention rather than a system because he didn't trust the system. That was why he told me. He paused. He made me the informal executor of his intent, without the formal legal designation, because he was Another pause, the careful choosing. A man who dealt in the informal where the formal frightened him. It was a limitation. It had consequences. It had consequences for me, she said, without heat. Yes, he said. I know. She looked at the document in her lap. He was afraid, she said, to acknowledge me. And at the end he left me everything, which is the most extreme form of acknowledgement there is. She turned this over. I've been trying to decide what to do with that contradiction. What have you decided? He said. She was quiet for a moment. That it's his contradiction to have lived with, she said, not mine to resolve. I can carry the inheritance without carrying the failure. She looked up. I think that's what's available to me, and I think it's enough. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said quietly. I think it is. The carriage moved through the last of the town and out onto the open road, and the moors opened up on either side, and the sky was enormous and gray and full of a specific quality of light that she had come to associate with this landscape. Not warm, not gentle, but honest. The light that showed you what was actually there. She watched it out the window and held the document in her lap and felt, moving beneath the settled quiet of the concluded legal proceeding. Something else. Something she had been aware of for most of the month and had been treating with the careful non-acknowledgement of a person who is not yet certain what it is and does not want to name it incorrectly. She was aware of it very specifically now, in this carriage, with the moors on either side and the document in her hands, and Adrian sitting 3 feet away from her, watching the same landscape she was watching. She was aware of it, and she was aware that he was aware of it, and she was aware that neither of them had said anything about it because the month had been full of work, and work was what she knew, and work was safe. In the way that the other thing was not safe, was the furthest thing from safe, was in fact the specific kind of risk that her entire constructed system of self-protection had been designed to avoid. The carriage hit a rut in the road. Her shoulder caught the side panel. His hand came out and steadied her arm, a quick, entirely practical gesture, over before it began, and she felt the brief warmth of it through her coat sleeve. And then it was gone. His hand back in his lap, his face turned to the road again, and she looked forward at the back of the driver's seat and breathed. Adrian, she said. He turned. When you said you weren't interested in leaving, she said, in October. What did you mean? A pause. Not a hesitant pause, a deliberate one. The pause of a man who has been precise with words his whole life and intends to continue being precise now. I meant, he said, that this house and this land and the work you're doing here are things I would like to continue to be part of. That your company is... Another pause. Something I find I am not willing to be without, if there is any alternative. And if I asked you to stay, she said, not through the month, permanently, in some form. He looked at her directly. Is that what you're asking? He said. She thought about the tea poured at the correct angle, about the room with the displaced furniture, about the girl who had learned to disappear so thoroughly that she had almost convinced herself it was a natural condition rather than a survival strategy. About the night in the library when a man had sat down across from her and said, "Show me," with a quality of attention that had, without her permission, begun to dismantle 23 years of very careful construction. Yes, she said. I think it is. He held her gaze for a long moment in the gray November light, and the carriage moved through the moors, and somewhere ahead Ravenhurst chimneys were visible against the sky, and she waited. Then I'll stay, he said. Bokat. The Thornbridge family left on the 28th day. Not the 30th, 28th. She had not expected this and had not asked for it, and she received the information from the footman on a Wednesday morning with the slightly disoriented quality of someone whose timeline has shifted. She did not go to watch them leave. That was not something she wanted to witness. Not out of mercy for them specifically, but because she had no need for the image. No need to see them reduced to departing figures on a gravel drive, the spectacle of their displacement used to confirm her victory. She knew they were leaving. That was sufficient. She was in the estate office when the last carriage wheels sounded on the drive, and she continued working, and after the sound faded, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the house. The specific quality of quiet that a building has when it is occupied only by the people who belong in it, and felt it. There was a knock at the door. It was Bessie. "They've gone, miss," she said. "All of them. Mr. Thomas has done a walk of the East Wing and everything's in order." "Thank you, Bessie," Lydia said. Bessie stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of someone who has one more thing to say. "Cook made a cake," she said. "In the kitchen." She said, and she said I should say it exactly. She said it's not a celebration exactly. It's just that it seemed like a day that wanted a cake. Lydia looked at her. "Tell Mrs. Farnham," she said, "that I will be in the kitchen in 20 minutes." She spent the 20 minutes walking the East Wing alone. She went through every room, the bedrooms, the sitting rooms, the small study, the dressing rooms, slowly and without purpose except the purpose of knowing the space. The Thornbridge family had taken their personal effects and had left the furniture, which belonged to the estate, and the rooms had the emptied, simplified quality of spaces between their inhabitants, waiting to be understood under new management. In the last room she entered, a small sitting room at the corner of the wing with windows facing both the garden and the moors, she stopped. There was a single object left on the windowsill, a small portrait, miniature, set in a simple oval frame, the kind of thing that might have been overlooked in packing, or might have been left deliberately, and she stood across the room and looked at it for a moment before crossing to pick it up. The face in the portrait was a man, say 40 or so, dark-featured, with a quality in the eyes that was familiar to her in the specific way that features you share with another person are familiar, slightly stranger than your own face, because they are seen from the outside. She looked at her father's face. She did not know who had left it. She did not know if it was carelessness or a gesture of some kind. Lady Thornbridge, perhaps, the woman who had noticed the eyes and had held the information for 3 years without knowing what to do with it. She turned the frame over. On the back, in a hand she didn't recognize, E. Vale, 1838, 2 years before his death. She stood in the corner sitting room of her East Wing and looked at the portrait of her father for a long time, at the eyes she had inherited and the face she had never known, and the man who had been by turns a failure and a partial redemption and a contradiction she had decided not to resolve. Then she set the portrait in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest, and went to the kitchen where Mrs. Farnham had made a cake and Bessie was already cutting it, and Thomas the footman was there, and 2 of the kitchen maids and the stable boy, who had been given permission to come inside because it seemed, in Mrs. Farnham's assessment, like the kind of day that expanded its borders to include people it might normally exclude. She sat at the kitchen table and ate cake with her household staff, and talked about the cattle expansion and the new spring planting schedule and the north wing room that needed its plaster redone now that the roof was sound. And outside the kitchen window the November light came down clean and indifferent on the Ravenhurst grounds. And she was home. The proposal, if it could be called that, and she would later debate with herself whether it properly qualified, happened in the estate office on a Thursday afternoon in December, which was entirely characteristic and entirely right, because neither of them were people for whom meaning required a stage. She was working through the spring land management plan. He was at the secondary desk she had put in for him. He had become, over the weeks, a genuine presence in the estate's work, not managing it and not directing it, but contributing to it with the specific knowledge of a man who had run 3 estates of his own and had the particular usefulness of someone who had made mistakes and knew which ones to avoid. It was, she found, an entirely functional arrangement, and also something considerably more than functional, the more difficult to name but consistently present. He looked up from what he was doing. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead," she said, without looking up from her figures. "Lydia." She looked up. He was watching her with the quality of attention that she had stopped trying to prepare herself for and had simply accepted as a feature of his presence in her life. Total, direct, patient, and capable of a warmth that was never performed and therefore entirely trustworthy. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. Not "will you marry me?" Not the question form, which would have put the weight of it on her answer before she'd had a moment to understand what was being said. "I want to ask you." The declaration first and then the space. She set down her pen. She looked at him across the desk. This man who had come to her in the library with his document case and his dead friend's promise and his careful, total attention, and who had stayed through the work and the cold and the cattle negotiations, and the plaster estimates, and the evening conversations over dinner that had become the part of each day she was least willing to abbreviate. "You said you weren't interested in leaving," she said. "I'm not," he said. "This would make it considerably more difficult to leave," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is rather the point." She thought about what marrying him would mean, practically, which was the form in which she understood everything. It would mean the legal complications of combining 2 estates and 2 titles and 1 acknowledged illegitimacy and 1 scandalous widowhood, none of which would be invisible or easy or the subject of no public opinion whatsoever. It would mean the particular exposure of a woman who had spent her life in the background becoming, through association and legal recognition, and the specific visibility that attended a duke's wife, exactly as prominent as she had spent 23 years learning not to be. It would mean being seen, fully, publicly, permanently seen. She had spent a week in October learning that being seen was survivable. She had spent the subsequent weeks learning that it was more than survivable, that it was, in fact, the thing she had been protecting herself from that she had most needed. She looked at him across the desk. "Yes," she said. "All right." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he repeated, in a tone that suggested this was either the best or the most characteristically Lydia answer he could have received, and he found it entirely satisfactory. "There will be consequences," she said. "People will have opinions about it." "Yes," he said. "The illegitimacy question is legally resolved by the will's authentication," he said. "You are the acknowledged daughter and heir of the 4th Earl of Ashcroft. That is the legal record." "Socially," she said. "Socially," he said, "people will say what they choose to say. They will say it with decreasing frequency as time passes, and as the reality of what you are doing here becomes visible to anyone paying attention." He paused. "And some of them, I suspect, will not say it at all, because they will look at you and calculate that it is not a wise use of their energy." She almost smiled. "You have a high opinion of the deterrent effect of my presence." "I have," he said simply. "An accurate one." She picked up her pen and looked at the land management plan, and then set the pen down again because this was not, she decided, a moment that should be immediately followed by returning to the spring planting schedule. "Come here," she said. He came around the desk and she stood, and they were face to face in the estate office of Ravenhurst Manor in the December afternoon, with the fire burning and the account books on the shelves and the specific quiet of a house that had found its right arrangement, and she looked at him for a moment. This man she had known for 8 weeks, and somehow also for much longer, the way you know certain landscapes, by the quality of the light they hold. She put her hand against his face, simply, directly, the most honest gesture she knew, and felt him lean into it fractionally, the smallest possible movement, the movement of a man who has been very still for a very long time and is learning, carefully, to move again. "I found you," she said. It surprised him. She could feel it in the quality of the stillness that followed, not the coldness of his public composure, but the specific stillness of someone receiving something unexpected in a place they had left unguarded. "I believe," he said very quietly, "that I said that first." "You did," she said. "In the library. I'm saying it back." He covered her hand with his, and outside the December wind moved over the moors and the fire burned and the estate accounts waited on the desk, and somewhere in the north wing the repaired beams held the ceiling steady against the winter, and none of it required comment. They were married in February. Not quietly. She had considered quiet and rejected it, because quiet was what she had been for 23 years, and she was done with it as a default. Not lavishly either, because lavish was a form of performance, and she had never been interested in performance. The ceremony was at the village church, witnessed by Harwick and Bessie and Mrs. Farnham and the Calwick family and Garrett the builder, and a selection of county neighbors whose attendance represented less social courtesy than genuine curiosity, because the story of Lydia Vale and Ravenhurst Manor had, in the months since October, moved through the county in the way that genuinely interesting things moved. Not gossip exactly, but a kind of collective absorption of information that people found themselves returning to and revising. The woman who had been the companion, the estate that had been stolen, the 4 months of account books in a small notebook, the Duke who had kept a promise. The people who attended the February ceremony came prepared to observe something, and what they observed was two people standing in a cold stone church with the February light coming through the plain windows, speaking their vows in clear voices without the theatrical emotion that sometimes attended such occasions, and also without the rigid formality that sometimes substituted for it. They spoke as people who meant what they were saying and were not particularly interested in the performance of meaning it. The county neighbors went home and revised their assessments further. Spring came early that year. The eastern pastures, allowed to rest through the winter, showed the first green of recovery in March. Tentative, patchy, the specific quality of land that is beginning to restore itself. She walked the south edge with Daniel Calwick, and they looked at the grass coming in and the drainage moving cleanly, and the lower 5 acres, no longer standing in water, beginning to show the color that meant life returning. "Next autumn," Daniel said, "we can run the cattle." "Next autumn," she agreed. She kept walking the farms, every Thursday. The notebook filled and she started a second one, and the second filled and she started a third, and the 3 notebooks on her estate office shelf became, over the course of the year, a living record of the land under her management, not the record of extraction that the Thornbridge years had produced, but something else, something that grew more detailed and more honest with each season, a conversation between a woman and a piece of land that was learning, together with her, what it could become. The North Wing study was reorganized in April. She and Adrian spent a Saturday moving shelves and debating the optimal orientation of the desk, a debate that lasted 2 hours and produced a result she suspected they had both known from the beginning, but had been enjoying the process too much to arrive at directly. She put her father's portrait on the desk, in the oval frame with E. Vale, 1838, on the back. She looked at it most mornings when she sat down to work, and what she felt when she looked at it changed over the months. Not disappearing into simple peace, which would have been dishonest, but shifting, settling, becoming something she could hold without it holding her. A contradiction she did not need to resolve. The legal proceeding against Granger and the Thornbridge family for the original fraud concluded in June. The judgment was financial, substantial, directed into the estate's recovery fund, and the social consequences were quiet but thorough, the particular way that scandal attaches itself to people who have been exposed as having done exactly what everyone suspected all along. Gerald Thornbridge left the county. Lady Thornbridge retired to a relation's house in the south. Millicent took her daughters to her own family's estate and was not seen in public for some time. Pemberton's conduct was reviewed by his professional body. The review took several months. The outcome was not announced in any journal she read, but Harwick mentioned it once in passing, with the professional neutrality of a man reporting a fact, and she received it and moved on. The Autumn Tenants Meeting, her idea, the first of its kind at Ravenhurst, held in the main hall with all the tenant farmers and their families present, took place in October, 1 year after the night a duke had arrived in a carriage and changed everything. She stood in front of 40 people, the farmers and their families, the household staff, the contracted workers who had spent the year repairing and improving and restoring the land she had inherited, and she talked about the estate's accounts in plain language, because she had decided from the beginning that the people whose work produced the estate's income had the right to understand what happened to it. She talked about what had been deferred and what was being addressed, and what the spring planting plans would produce, and what the cattle expansion on the eastern parcels meant for the tenancy rates for the next 3 years. She answered questions. There were many. Robert Calwick, in the front row, had the expression he had worn since their first conversation, the careful expression of a man who has decided to invest trust cautiously and is updating his assessment of the return. He asked 2 questions, both specific, both about the eastern parcels. She answered both completely. At the end, he nodded, just once. The same deliberate weight his son's nod had carried 11 months ago at the drainage outlet. She received it. Daniel Calwick, beside his father, was looking at her with the expression that she had, over the course of the year, come to understand as his version of unqualified approval, which was the absence of skepticism entirely. Not enthusiasm, not performance, simply the clean, working-order expression of a man who has no reservations. She went home that evening and sat in the estate office and opened the account books. The current ones, the ones she had built from scratch in October of last year. and looked at the columns she had made, the figures she had entered week by week in her small, precise hand, the running record of a land being managed with the intention of its long-term health rather than its short-term yield. The numbers were not yet what they would eventually be. That would take years. She knew it and had planned for it and was not impatient about it, because patience was something she had developed very thoroughly over a very long apprenticeship in difficulty. But they were moving in the right direction. She was always sure of the right direction now. In the winter of that year, her first child was born. A girl, dark-eyed and quiet in the particular way of babies who are observing rather than merely experiencing, and she held her in the estate office at dawn on the first morning because she had been working when the labor began and had refused to go further than the first floor, and looked at the face that was not quite hers and not quite Adrian's but some new arrangement of both of them, and felt something that no ledger column could contain. She thought about her mother, whose name she had never known. She thought about her father, whose eyes she could see in the child's face already, the specific shape of the outer corner. She thought about 23 years of being no one, and the library at night, and the notebook with its careful figures, and the loose board under the desk, and the keys going warm in her hand. She thought about the girl who had learned to disappear, and the woman who had learned that disappearing was not survival, but its opposite, and the specific long road between those two people. Adrian came in at 6 o'clock. He looked at the child and then at her, and his face did the thing it did rarely and entirely without performance, opened, briefly, into something she had no word for that was nonetheless one of the clearest things she had ever seen. He sat beside her. "What will you name her?" he said quietly. She had thought about this for months. She had arrived at the answer only recently, in the way she arrived at answers, not by deliberating but by noticing that the answer was already there, had been there for a while, and she had simply needed to look at it directly. "Clara," she said, after no one in particular. A child who was no one's echo but herself. He looked at the girl, who was looking back at both of them with the ancient, assessing calm of a person for whom the world is still entirely new and therefore entirely possible. "Clara," he said. "Yes, Paten." Years later, many years, enough that the estate had come fully into its own, that the eastern pastures had been running cattle for 6 seasons, that the north wing's replastered rooms had become the ones she loved best, that the staff of Ravenhurst had grown and changed, and was now largely composed of people who had come to the manor under her management and knew no other. She stood in the garden on an October afternoon and watched her children run. 3 of them by then, Clara and a boy named Thomas, and another girl they called Nell. They ran through the box hedging, the geometric precision of which had, under her ownership, softened slightly at the edges, allowed to be slightly less controlled than the Thornbridge years had imposed, and their voices came back to her on the autumn air, clear and uncomplicated, the voices of children who were running through their own ground and knew it without having to think about it, the way you know the things that have always been certain. Adrian came to stand beside her. He was older. They both were. The years had settled into them the way years settle into people who have used them fully, leaving evidence of the use but not diminishing the essential thing. And he stood the way he had always stood, unhurried, present, the specific quality of his attention undimmed by familiarity. He looked at the children and then at her. "Clara's going to be trouble," he said. "Yes," Lydia agreed, with the satisfaction of a mother who has recognized herself in her daughter's particular form of trouble. "I know." Clara had at 10 years old taken apart the mechanism of the estate office clock, diagnosed its fault, and repaired it with a hairpin and a piece of wire in approximately the time it had taken Lydia to notice it was missing. She had then written down what she had done in a small notebook, her own notebook, acquired from somewhere, Lydia had not asked where, in her small, precise handwriting. Lydia had found the notebook on the desk and had opened it and read 3 pages and then sat for a long time with it in her hands while something moved through her that was too large and too tender to be identified directly. "She'll be all right," Lydia had said to Adrian that evening, meaning several things at once. He had understood all of them. Now she stood in the October garden and watched her children run across the land that she had repaired and maintained and given years of careful, specific, loving work. And she felt what she felt. Not the absence of the past, because the past was present in everything, was in fact the specific material out of which the present had been constructed, but the past in its proper position. Behind her. Informing but not governing. Evidence, not sentence. The girl who had learned to disappear had become a woman who had learned something more difficult and more necessary, to remain, to stay visible, stay present, stay in the open where the wind was cold and the work was real and the people who depended on her could see her and she could see them. To rule not because it was given to her, but because she had built it, from the ground up, from a notebook and a loose board, and 4 months of careful numbers, and the specific stubborn refusal to accept that invisibility was a permanent condition rather than a learned one. Adrian's hand found hers. She held it. The children ran through the hedging, and their voices came back on the October air, and the moors lay beyond the garden wall in their enormous, indifferent sweep, and the manor stood at her back with its repaired roof and its honest accounts, and its autumn tenants' meetings, and its kitchen where Mrs. Farnham still presided and still occasionally made cake on days that seemed to want one. She thought, for no particular reason, of the night in the library, the candle, the notebook open on the table between them, the quality of being looked at by someone who was actually looking. She had been invisible for so long that she'd forgotten being seen was a possibility. She had remembered. And the man standing beside her now, the man who had first walked into a library and looked directly at her when no one else in the world was looking, leaned close the way he had that first night, and said the 3 words that had changed everything. Not I found you. Something new. Something that the years had earned. You built this, he said quietly. She looked at her children running through the garden of the house she owned, in the county where her name was known, on the land she had walked and measured and repaired and learned, season by season, the way you learn the things that are yours. She had built this. From nothing. From a notebook and a locked box and the specific, indestructible quality of a mind that would not look away from wrong numbers. From the things she had always had, even when she had nothing else. From the inside. She squeezed his hand once and looked out at her land and remained.